Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. I'm just going to remind people that we are in a public meeting in West Offices. If you have your mobile phones turned on, could you please make sure that they're on silent or turn them off? If you need to use the toilet at all, toilets are through the door just behind me, and we're not expecting any sort of a fire alarm or anything like that. So if the alarms do go off, we will all help you out of the building as quickly as we can through the nearest available exits. Before we start the meeting formally, I've got a couple of apologies and substitutions to record. So I've received apologies from Councillor Rowley with no substitution, and from Councillor Baker from the Green Group, who is being substituted by Councillor One from the Liberal Democrat Group. As always in this situation, I will formally record that I believe that this arrangement is contrary to the spirit and the purpose of the legislation. And we do now have a new monitoring officer who I believe is looking into the arrangements that have been happening in this committee for the past 2 years. Move us on then to the formal agenda items. Agenda item 1 is declarations of interest. Does anybody have anything that they wish to declare? Not seeing any hands from anybody. I'm just going to record that, as I have done previously, that my mum is on the steering group of the York Disability Rights Forum, which is one of the 27 organisations that make up the Reverse the Ban Coalition, which we will inevitably be going on to discuss their petition. So moving us on then to agenda item 2, which is the minutes from the 3rd of October. Does anybody have anything in relation to the minutes that they wanted to change or amend? No. So if everybody's happy, I'll sign them as an accurate record. I just will note on page 3, there's 2 or 3 bullet points of things that came out of the last meeting that we wanted to get additional information on, and a request to be made to 2 of the other scrutiny committees. I'm pretty confident that all of that information has been received and that I know that the requests have been made, but I must confess I hadn't double checked that every last bit of information has come through. So I will just go and double check that we've received everything we should have done from that. So moving us on then to agenda item 3, which is public participation. We have 4 people registered to speak this evening. Each of them will be given 3 minutes to address the committee. The first person to speak is Diane Roweth, who is at the table already. Diane, you've got 3 minutes to address the committee. I'll give you a heads up at around 30 seconds before the end of your time. So if you'd like to start whenever you're ready to.
At the 20th of October council meeting, the depth of feeling about the blue badge ban was witnessed in person and by the presentation of the Reverse the Ban petition. But also importantly, there was unanimous agreement that York Council adopts the social model of disability. The social model says that people with impairments are disabled by the decisions other people take. If society does not remove barriers, people with impairments become disabled people, prevented from taking part in society, from being customers and patrons. The 700 comments from Reverse the Ban postcards describe that so well, and it's great to see that they have been included here with the papers tonight. The administration has chosen to disable people by banning blue badge holders from the city centre. The head of transport tells us they made that decision on balance. We at Reverse the Ban think not. It was not a balanced decision, as it only gave weight to the views of the police, who when prompted said blue badge holders are a risk to security. It just so happens that by banning blue badge holders, the administration got what it really wanted, a car-free city centre. All its future plans are based on that discriminatory achievement, the ban of blue badge holders. The social model of disability is about removing not just physical, but attitudinal barriers, and these are the hardest. Disabled people are experiencing attitudinal barriers all the time under this administration. The Reverse the Ban petition is included in the report on city centre access, I guess to keep the momentum going, but I have to say the two things are separate. Banning blue badge holders was a decision separate from city centre access improvements, which only help those people who can get into the city centre. Those improvements are totally inadequate, and money taken from future transport budgets is going to make the situation even worse. Is it now time to admit that this administration's attitude towards disabled people has to change? To admit that it uses words like consultation, co-production, and lived experience without knowing the true meaning? Pavement cafes cannot have lived experience, only people.
You've got about 30 seconds left.
To admit that this administration will go to any lengths for a car-free city centre with pavement cafes, like ignoring the Martin Higgett report and the advice of the RNIB solicitor to observe current legislation. Instead, it pays more public money for a pavement cafe consultation that I chose not to participate in, as it has no terms of reference, is too small and too short a timescale. So I question its validity. So please tonight, put the social model of disability into practice. Do everything in your power to ensure that Reverse the Ban's 2,700 petitioners and disabled people themselves are treated with respect and their request debated at the highest level of the council at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you very much for coming this evening. Committee will obviously take into account anything that you've said there and may want to ask some questions on it when we get to that agenda item. If you'd like to take your seat back in the public gallery now, and I will then invite our second speaker, which is Tom Franklin, who I think is speaking as chair of the Green Party in York. Is that correct? So Tom, you've got three minutes to address the committee. I'll try and give you a heads up when you've got about 30 seconds left, and over to you to start in your own time.
Okay, thank you. I'm speaking as chair of York Green Party. Recently, the party discussed access to the city centre and in particular access for disabled people. We noted the advice from North Yorkshire Police, but we note that the advice from the police does not contain any form of accessibility assessment, and therefore the advice provided is woefully incomplete. We're not particularly concerned about the form of the barriers and do not have the expertise to consider their design in detail. What is important is who can get through them and when. Clearly, it is important to minimise the risk of a terrorist attack, but it is also essential that people are able to do what they want or need to do. I want to welcome the positive actions to improve disabled access into and around the city centre set out in the paper, but also call for further action to look at how blue badge holders who rely on their vehicles to access the core shopping streets can do so during foot street hours. It's welcome that the actions set out in the paper are now starting to progress. These will bring long overdue improvements to the city centre, access for many disabled people. Changement to the pavement cafe guidance are rightly being made a priority, as is the increase in drop curves. It would be good to see other measures, such as improved seating and extension of shop mobility, visible on the ground as soon as possible. It is great that a consultant has been appointed to progress the city centre shuttle bus, but we do need to get on with seeing some actual trials of the buses. To be clear, we do not have a problem with the restriction of most movement during the day in the evening, but there are disabled people who are simply unable to walk or wheel any considerable distance. Many blue badge holders simply cannot travel 50 metres, and they need to be able to get close to where they need to be. Many of the places are a considerable distance from the nearest parking point. The post office is about 300 metres from the nearest parking space, the banks are about 250 metres, and so on. This is unacceptable, and whilst we welcome the mitigations discussed above, these do not address the issues for a significant number of people. We believe that the council must, in order to meet its legal obligations under the Equalities Act, and because it is morally right, ensure that disabled people can access the city centre. This means developing a policy and procedure to enable blue badge holders to access and park in the city centre. The council has already had detailed advice from many people, including the Higgett report and the Civic Trust. We need to ensure that appropriate access for blue badge holders is provided alongside the other measures being taken. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And you had about 20 seconds left, so I didn't need to prompt you, but again, your comments, I'm sure, will be taken on board by committee, and any questions that members feel that they wish to ask, I'm sure they will do at the appropriate moments. So the next public speaker I have is Adam Myers, so if you'd like to come to the table, and as with previous participants, you've got 3 minutes to address the committee, and I'll try to give you a heads up when you've got about 30 seconds left.
Hello, thank you for allowing the space to speak. You have received a petition from thousands of people demanding that you reverse the ban on cars in the city centre for blue badge holders. I appeal to you to listen to these voices. You have chosen knowingly and consciously as a council to in effect ban people who are dependent on a car for access needs from their own city centre. Some are my friends. This obviously has a huge impact on them from a practical point of view and from a social point of view, and that is important, but the impact is far deeper than that. You've now added a weight to carry for them to carry in a society that already discriminates and already literally builds barriers to their full participation. You are telling my friends they are not part of us, not part of everyone, they are not citizens. Their presence, their selves is not important. That is a terrible harm that you have chosen as a council to do to your own citizens, and is part of a slippery slope. It is wrong. And it does harm to me, who cannot see my friends in the city centre, and I see them hurting. As one of those that might be called temporarily able-bodied or not yet disabled, as I look forward a few years, the impairments that are certainly coming my way may exclude me from full citizenship too, and each of you. And what it does, and what does it do to all of us when, as a city, we are colluding in the denial of basic human rights? You banned cars from the city centre because you feel you have a reason that justifies all the harms you're doing to your own citizens. I think we all know the real reason is economic, but the excuse is terrorism, using a car as a weapon. But as citizens of this council, we all know that access to the city centre with a car, at the moment, all you need to do, if you want to access the city, is to drive the wrong way up a one-way street. So what you are doing in spending huge amounts of money on barriers to protect us from is to protect us from someone who has so lost their sense of shared humanity, they are planning on using a car as a weapon for multiple murder. But that same person, we are meant to believe, is not prepared to break the traffic regulation and drive the wrong way up a one-way street. That is ludicrous. It is a ludicrous logic. I know
You've got about 30 seconds left.
Thank you. I know it's hard to hold your hand up and say you have made a mistake, but it is time for you to do so. I appeal to you to listen to the thousands of voices on the postcards. Listen to the protesters outside the last full council meeting. I appeal to you to listen to logic and reason and human rights, and listen to the social model of disability. And above all, I appeal to you to listen to your hearts and your human caring. Reverse this ban.
Thank you very much for coming this evening. And again, as with the other speakers, the committee members have all heard your points, and I'm sure we'll be mulling them over and we'll ask questions appropriately when we get to that item. Thank you. So the final public speaker that we have this evening is Councillor Pete Kilbane, who is the Deputy Leader of the Labour Group. And Pete, I think you know the score.
Just the 5 minutes, yeah.
Just the 5 minutes. No, if you get to 2 minutes 30, you're having a strict warning.
Okay, I think I'll be fine. Yeah, and thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee. I don't want to go over old ground. The issue's been debated at length, and the Labour Group position is clear. We will enable blue badge access to the city centre if residents choose to elect us next May. I just want to deal with the obvious fallacy of the Lib Dem Green position, which has now been compounded by yet more hypocritical posturing, such as we've heard from the Greens this evening. Every resident who has given the blue badge ban 2 minutes thought can see the fallacy of the Lib Dem Green argument. The stated position has been that the police and counter-terrorism officers told them to ban blue badge drivers. They didn't. They told them they should create a sterile zone. That means stopping all vehicle movements at certain times within the city centre. In the words of Superintendent Mark Khan in March this year, the advice from the North East Counter-Terrorism Police, which is supported by North Yorkshire Police, is that the identified vulnerable area within the vehicle access scheme should only be accessible to emergency vehicles when it's in operation. Hostile vehicle mitigation is only effective if adhered to strictly. Otherwise, all we are doing is compromising the integrity of the scheme. But we all know that this was advice. Superintendent Khan added, the local authority have to carry out their own risk assessment based on the advice given. And this is exactly what the Lib Dem Greens did. They rejected the police advice to create a sterile zone, and then they made a risk assessment that allows a whole host of exempt vehicles into the city centre to this day, while specifically excluding blue badge holders. The irony, of course, is that it is the person, not the vehicle, that holds a blue badge. So actually, given the extensive vetting process that goes with attaining a blue badge, these are actually the safest drivers to allow past the barriers. The Lib Dem Green excuse that blue badge holders posed a particular terrorist threat was an obvious fallacy, and we all know that it's got nothing to do with security and everything to do with pavement cafe licences. And now we see posturing from the Greens, with Councillor Craghill hinting at a review and leading Green activists turning up to criticise the ban. Let us remind everyone that it was nearly 1 year ago today, on the 18th of November, that this dreadful act of direct discrimination was made permanent. It was supported by all executive members, 7 Lib Dems, plus Green councillors Craghill and De Gorn. All 9 voted for it in full knowledge of what they were doing to some of the most vulnerable residents of our city.
That's 30 seconds.
Now that the local elections are looming, we see posturing and backtracking, especially from the Greens. Well, it's too late. Do not add insult to injury by protesting against the decisions that you yourself have made and are responsible for. The petition could not be more explicit in criticising the actions of the administration, nor more moving in describing the impact it's had on people's lives. The residents of York are neither stupid or forgetful, and the actions of this administration will be held to account next May.
Thank you very much. That was spot on 3 minutes. And as with the previous speakers, I'm sure that there was plenty there for committee members to consider and ask any appropriate questions when the time comes. So that brings us to the end of the public participation section. So we move on to agenda item 4, which is the probably main item of business this evening, which is the City Centre Access Action Plan update. So if I could invite James Gilchrist as Director of Transport, Environment and Planning, and Dave Atkinson as Head of Highways and Transport to join the table. We have Councillor Andy De Gorn already at the table, who's the exec member for Transport. And then we've also have a number of stakeholders with us this evening. So if I go down the line on the to my left-hand side, I think it's the right-hand side as you're viewing at home. We have Flick Williams with us, who's here on behalf of the York Disability Rights Forum, and I think is an access specialist, certainly in a former life. We have Scott Jobson, who is Chief Executive of My Site York, and we have Jim Cannon, who is the Chair of York Older People's Assembly. Now, also in the background, we have Jane Burton, who is representing York Accessibility Action and is also Chair of the Lawyers with Disabilities Division of the Law Society of England and Wales, and is a member of the Law Society's Equality and Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Jane was due to be with us in person, but has had to attend online. So what we've done is we've set up an arrangement whereby she will be able to make some opening comments, and then I can see if her hand goes up. It's the first time for us this evening trying this out, so I will hopefully be able to bring her in during the roundtable discussion as well. But as I say, it might be a little bit hit and miss as we go. So my plan for the evening is I will first of all invite the officers just to speak to the report that we've received this evening, and then I've asked each of the stakeholders to just give us a very brief sort of overview of the organisation that they're here representing, and a brief sort of overview of how things have been for them over the last year since this change came in, and how the access plan is progressing from their point of view. My expectation then is that we can have a bit of a roundtable discussion, members asking questions of officers and stakeholders, but I've told the stakeholders they're also very welcome to ask us any questions that they may have. And likewise, officers, if there's points of clarity that you wish from anything that anybody says, I'm very happy to do that as well. Depending on how we progress, I'll either call an adjournment at the end of this agenda item to allow people to leave, or if it feels appropriate and it feels like the item's gone on a little while, I may call an adjournment part way through. We'll just play that by ear slightly. So, Dave, I don't know if you're planning to present, or James, but either of you, if you want to just give us a quick walkthrough of the report. Great.
Thank you, Chair. So prior to November's executive last year, there was a pre-decision scrutiny by this committee, and they looked at the papers that the executive were due to get, and that included the action plan for the city centre. And scrutiny have sought to review that action plan. The action plan was also reviewed by executive in July this year, which also committed to a review of the guidance around pavement cafe licences, as you know. In discussion with the chair, we've focused the report around that action plan, and it's your choice, Chair, really, whether you want us to go through that action plan line by line or do it through the discussion element, but that's the primary focus of the paper before you today.
Thank you. I think it would probably be helpful, just very briefly, just to talk us through the sort of line by line, but not in huge detail, because obviously we've all seen and read the papers. But I think if you can just give us a very brief kind of overview, I'm sure it's something that we'll want to return to and perhaps pick up specific points.
Yep. Okay. So the first line of the action plan is about creating an access officer post. Pauline Stutchfield, who's the director, is here, but we are close to finalising that appointment. So any day now, there should be some blue smoke, as it were, in terms of an appointment, hopefully.
Sorry, I should just say for anybody either at home or in the room, the action plan starts on page 15. So if you've got that in your papers.
There are then a number of actions that relate to the pieces of work that the access officer was going to do. Some of those are left with the access officer, and some of which have been sublet to a consultant to speed the process up, because we tried to appoint an access officer earlier in the year and weren't successful. So in order to progress things, executive approved the appointment of a consultant. So I'll go through that and explain that as we go through. So one of the first actions for the access officer was developing a York standard. That still remains with the access officer to do. And one of the things the committee might want to consider is those things that are currently assigned to the access officer. In what priority do you see them? So as an access officer arrives, are they going to try and do it all, or does it make sense to pick bits off and focus on specific bits of work? So that might be a useful thing for the committee to consider. The consulting on permanent extending the foot streets until 7 PM, executive decided not to do that, so that's not progressed. Implementing the disabled bays as per the statutory consultation, those additional disabled blue badge bays have all been installed. The 10k investment to shop mobility has been delivered in terms of the short-term investment, and the piece of work to work with shop mobility that the access officer is going to work on will be picked up by the access officer once they start. In a similar way, the investment in the dial-a-ride service, the short-term funding has happened. That's been passed over, and the investment in the wider dial-a-ride and bus services is part of the study on city centre shuttle feasibility, which we'll come on to in a minute. The work with TIA, who we as a council give permission to operate the e-scooter scheme. One of the things that was being looked at was whether they could come up with some clever technology that would operate as a mobility aid and operate in a similar way. We are lobbying them on that. They are obviously a national company operating national contracts. That is something they are looking at. The next line on it is to assess what constitutes a mobility aid. Again, that's something for the access officer to pick up, which hopefully will happen shortly. The next one was around drop curbs and improved access. The works in Stonegate delivered some, and we are currently, as we speak, working in Fossgate to add additional drop curbs at the moment. The additional seating, the consultants that we appointed, MEMA, they have a piece of work that will be happening the next month probably, which is to look at where that seating is best placed and to engage to make sure we do that in the right way, both in terms of location and the style of seating, etc. There was an action around toilets, and there's some information there about the funding we've secured to improve toilet provision, both in terms of our own toilets, but also in terms of making other toilets in the city centre accessible. The next one was around carrying out a feasibility study. Originally, that was going to be funded by the bus service improvement plan when executive first approved this back in November. BSIP, that funding took a lot longer than expected, and executive agreed to fund that from a separate source. And we had a kick-off meeting with the consultants who were going to do that piece of work around the feasibility study last week, with a view to allowing potential users to experience a bus in Residents' Week in the new year.
The consultant who were undertaking that piece of work, a transport consultant, but we've put in the contract for them to specifically work with an access consultant on that piece of work. The next one was about improving awareness of Blue Badge Parking. We've done that both through our website, but we've also done it through a hard copy leaflet, which we're updating again for Christmas this year. The work with the Quality Bus Partnership and local disability representatives, that piece of work has moved on through the change in legislation. So we now have the enhanced partnership, and the absolute intention of that is that disability groups become part of that representation in that structure of meetings around the enhanced partnership. Improving existing city centre cycle routes was conditional upon active travel funding as part of the last round of active travel funding. That element of the project wasn't funded by DFT, but it is one of the projects that we'll be putting forward as part of our local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, and hope that we will be able to secure funding for that in the future. On the other hand, we were successful in terms of securing funding for city centre cycle parking. That funding came through earlier this year, so we will be rolling that out imminently in terms of additional parking. The forum, the Taxi Association forum, my understanding is that some disability advocacy groups have attended some of those meetings and are welcome to attend any of them in the future. I think I've missed one in all that paperwork. I think there was one around, yeah, sorry, I've missed a page in my excitement. So there's the transshipment hub for freight delivery. We are close to finalising the location for that, and that will run into a trial probably early in the new year. There was also an action about understanding the evolving nature of food delivery businesses. That work is ongoing, but the move to 5 PM rather than 7 PM in terms of foot street hours to a certain extent has lessened the impact on food deliveries, but that is something we are keeping under review. Clearer signage we have sorted, and the potential new evening rank on Piccadilly has been considered by licensing committee, and they want to consider it in the round, but there is a taxi rank on Piccadilly. I think that's as whistle stop as I can do it, Chair, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I'm sure that there'll be specific questions that we'll want to bring up. I'm just going to note, it does strike me as though almost all of those items that you've just gone through are things that will be done, or that might be done, or that are being explored. when we looked at this last year, and it is almost a year to the day that the last scrutiny committee looked at this, I think a considerable amount of weight was put by the committee members who supported proceeding with the removal of the exemption on the fact that there was an action plan in place. So it is quite disappointing to see that a year on, virtually nothing has happened. Certainly from the report that we've got here. What I'm going to do now is just go to the stakeholders, because other people who probably have the lived experience, and it would just be helpful to get their perspective. And then, as I say, there's an opportunity for us all then to explore in some greater detail. So I'm just going to start at the top and work down the line. So I'll start with you, Flick, and then Jane, who's in the background, I'll come to you last after the other three have spoken. So Flick, if you want to start.
Thank you, Chair. So my name is Flick Williams, and I'm here on behalf of York Disability Rights Forum. I'm a retired access consultant and disability equality trainer, and I've been involved in the disability rights movement since before the Disability Discrimination Act was passed in 1995. I've worked in disability services for both local authorities and fully funded user-led organisations of disabled people. I've worked with disabled people across all impairment groups, and I was previously offered but declined a position as an access officer, and I have a master's degree in disability studies. So I was late to these issues by virtue of having been in and out of hospital all of last year, but have been fully across them since November last year, and have spoken in public participation on issues of access and inclusion across the last 11 months. So I should like to begin by continuing Helen's analogy of the jigsaw when she spoke at this meeting last year about the different mitigations proposed as being pieces of a jigsaw where some work for some individuals and others work for others, whilst for those for whom there is simply no mitigation to the closure of the foot streets for blue badge holders, they're the hole left in the middle of the puzzle, the missing pieces that represent those who are left behind and excluded. So how is our jigsaw looking 1 year further on? Well, we have the lid of the box, which tells us what the completed picture is supposed to look like, albeit with its missing pieces from the centre. And then we have the box where most of the other pieces remain, and a distinct feeling that there is a notable lack of urgency in getting on and completing this jigsaw. Looking into the box more closely reveals more pieces have gone missing. There is some suggestion as to where they might be, but looking for them is dependent on so many different things that other jigsaw puzzles are perhaps now considered more pressing to complete. I understand that we should be looking in more detail at the mitigations as we go through the meeting, but I would just like to make a few observations by way of introduction. First, the harm being done to those excluded is immense, and the postcard comments included in the agenda attest to that. I typed some of them up myself and find them difficult to read, as it further fuels my anger at this whole situation. But secondly, I want to talk about the cafe licensing situation, as this was only really discussed in passing at pre-decision scrutiny. For those of us still able to get to the city centre, despite the blue badge exclusion, the cafe licensing has itself become an increasing problem for access over this last summer. Despite very, very clear government guidance that was strengthened in July, the narrative in this authority is one of wait and see, let's consult some more, or some might say kick further down the road. It was only in July, in response to a letter from the RNIB, that advised this authority it was, in their opinion, acting unlawfully, that the executive turned its attention to cafe licensing. I question why we are even holding this consultation I've come from this afternoon. It seems to me that once again, responses are being sought that match with the existing regime. And then after that, there is now, I am told, to be consultation on city centre seating, and then after that, gold standard car parks. Well, this authority spent £25,000 on the Martin Higgett Associates report, which was a thorough and comprehensive piece of work that covered all these issues. After being buried in 1,000 pages of papers for scrutiny last year, it has been buried without trace, only ever mentioned now by members of the disabled community in the cycling campaign. I really struggle to understand this need to keep on reinventing the wheel and repeating work that has already been done against a backdrop of immensely challenging financial times for this authority. The only explanation that makes sense to me is to rinse and repeat until an answer emerges that is more palatable to what has already been predetermined. So to conclude, I should like to tell you about a woman I met on Fossgate Bridge who told me that before the outdoor dining began, she came to the centre every morning on foot for daily shopping, pushing her learning disabled daughter in her wheelchair. She told me that her daughter is distraught at now being left out of these daily outings because her ageing mother finds it just too difficult to constantly get her wheelchair on and off the pavements around the multitude of outdoor cafes. So in the last year, this authority has not only made permanent the exclusion of blue badge holders before implementing mitigations, it is now by its actions excluding a further group of disabled citizens who never even used vehicular transport to access their city centre previously, whilst all the while pushing a media and public relations narrative of the city being inclusive, accessible and welcoming to all. The act of excluding blue badge holders has in itself allowed a second layer of discriminatory action, which excludes even more of us. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Flick. I'm just going to go straight on to Scott, if you want to just tell us very briefly what MySite is and does and what your experience has been over the past year.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chair. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Jobson. I'm the Chief Executive of MySite York. I'm here, I suppose, as representing a member-led organisation of all of York's 7,000 blind and partially sighted people. I suppose I could be here representing York's 8,300 blind and partially sighted people, which is what that number is projected to be within the next 10 years. So I suppose I'm here representing people who are losing their sight as well today. Last year for me, Chair, has been, I suppose I can't even mince my words, a one of abject disappointment, because I did join MySite York at the start of the pandemic, even with a lot of optimism and positivity, because I've done similar roles across all of Yorkshire, working as RNIB's lead across that region, working with multiple stakeholders and local authorities such as Leeds, Hull, Bradford, Halifax, to introduce best practice, mostly via co-produced policies and street charters, and that's what I set out to do when I first joined. And for those who don't know, street charters are an agreement that sets out a real way of working together collaboratively, councillors and residents, to make streets accessible to all people. And I pulled together a group of multiple stakeholders and affected parties, such as the Wilberforce Trust, RNIB, York Disability Rights Forum, Guide Dogs, Age UK York, York Older People's Assembly and others, to agree ways to remove or reduce barriers that disabled people and others with restricted mobility face in our city, and sets out actions and commitments that the council and disabled people agree that will improve these issues. It was a good piece of work, masterclass in collaboration, if I don't say so myself. But I think over the last year, I did realize that was all really for nothing, because how could I, in all conscience, bring something that sets out how we work together collaboratively and bring that here? I think I might have mentioned it over a year ago at the last meeting, but with an administration that introduces measures that have the opposite effect of that. And what blind and partially sighted people are telling me and our organisation is that it's getting worse. A-boards are back out on streets, cafe furniture is out, e-scooters are growing and left as trip hazards. There's still no audio alerts that were promised two and a bit years ago. No tap rails around bays, parking on pavements, inaccessible crossings. These are all areas that we could work on together under a street charter. But then, of course, last year came the blue badge parking ban, which impacted immeasurably on blind and partially sighted people here in York. And as a charity that receives no statutory funding, we had to reshape our services because of the ban, to introduce a bespoke telephone befriending service to work with some of the most isolated people in our community, because they couldn't come in. They couldn't come into the centre anymore. And I don't know what the answers are. I don't know how we rebuild these bridges. I just know it needs to happen. My site York are here to help with that. We'll be looking forward to working with the new access officer who has a big job to do looking at these minutes. And yes, I was pleased to be part of that recruitment as well. But yeah, last year for me has just been heartbreaking, truly heartbreaking. As a human, I'm gutted that we've got to the point where we've banned other humans from doing the same things as everybody else. There we go.
Thanks, Scott. That's yeah, really helpful. I'm sure there's a few bits and bobs in there that we'll might want to ask you a few more questions about, but I'm just going to move on for now to Jim. So again, if you could just do a brief overview, that'd be great.
I'll try. Good evening. I'm Jim Cannon and I chair York Older People's Assembly. We're a campaign group for older people. And as I said a year ago when sitting in this meeting, you will be old someday. Well, I can see some of you are old now, but the point is that there, but for the grace of God, go you or I, in the case of disabled people, people who are in wheelchairs and the like, and a significant percentage of them are older people. I mentioned last year that there were two particular issues that would be affected by the blue badge ban. One was a centre in the middle of town, the St. Sampson's Centre for Older People. There are lots of people who used to go there, they used to get dropped off at the door and picked up, and they can't now. This has a bad effect on the people in St. Sampson's. The number of people who go has dropped dramatically. A lot of that is down to COVID. I fully accept that. But when you look at what is going on, you look at COVID and there are, I don't know what the latest number is, but the last number I remember was something over 200,000 deaths. The majority of those are older people. You had situations where happily married older couples, often with one person looking after the other as a carer, an informal carer, often pushing them around in a wheelchair, became single people, widows or widowers. And that situation has made life even worse. It still carries on now. I was looking at some figures recently about bus use in York. Pre-COVID, bus levels are now at 90% for normal people. For older people with concession passes, it was recently measured at 65%. There is this great threat of isolation, and the more we are putting pressure on people to keep out of the city, the worse it is. There is less and less contact. I was talking to somebody recently who said they'd been in the city twice in the last 18 months. And previously they were regular visitors. Now, this is just inhuman. And what we have here is a situation where the ban on blue badges is totally disproportionate, in my opinion, in the opinion of many of our members, in the opinion of 2,700 plus, and some of the comments that are in there are heartbreaking. Some of them are a bit rude. Some of them, they're a full range of ordinary people. That's what they are. And what we've got is a situation where the plan from last year, just to move on to it, most of it hasn't happened. And the Martin Higgett report, which was produced, and to my mind was a very professional document, had specific recommendations. It also said, introduction, reasonable access. Access needs to be reasonable. In the interim, until reasonable access is provided via a range of interventions, some blue badge parking should be allowed in certain parts of the city centre. And you've not done it. And that has had a knock-on effect in all sorts of ways. I will give you credit for one thing, and that is opening up Castlegate again, because we have our open meetings at the Friends Meeting House. Lots of other people meet in the Friends Meeting House. And until recently, blue badge holders couldn't park in Castlegate. They can now, And for that, that's an example of how things can be back to better. Back to better. Crumbs, I remember that from a former Prime Minister. But the same sort of thing should apply to York City Council. We should be doing things to helping people get back to normal. And what we're doing is the exact opposite. And one of the points that's been made about the cafe culture is precisely that. It's impossible to walk around the city. Yopa was one of the organisations that led in persuading the council to implement the removal of A-boards, because they were a big hindrance for people who were blind, partially sighted, but people who were old and doddery. And let's not forget, we could be old and doddery soon. It's worse now. It's much, much worse. And it's not helped when you've got people who are trying to help others, especially through the use of blue badge facilities, to get into the city. You're stopping them, and it's bad. And if you look at this plan, as Councillor Crawshaw said, most of them haven't happened. And I think that is something which in any ordinary organisation, you'd say this is a disgrace. Please take note of all the comments that have been made by people about removing the ban. These are people who feel very strongly about it, and so do we.
Thanks very much, Jim. I'm going to go to Jane now. This is where we see whether the technology is working for us. So Jane, I can see you've unmuted. And I can hear you. Brilliant. So if you could just, again, just give a brief overview to the committee, and then I'm going to be keeping an eye on your screen when we come into questions and things for your hand going up. But I'll hand over to you briefly now.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll try and speak as fast as possible, but I do have the tail ends of COVID, so it might make me a little bit slow. I'm a member of York Accessibility Action, and until this ban on blue badge parking in the city centre, I had a few friends who were disabled in York, but I was just another person living in York. As a disabled person, I came across Alison Hume, who'd set up the petition to reopen the city centre, the Close to Us petition. And we had to establish York Accessibility Action to mount a legal challenge to this discrimination. So here we are almost 1 year on, and what has happened? Why have MEMA been brought in to identify gold standard car parks? Wasn't this already covered in the Martin Higgett report, which already cost the Liberal Democrat Green Coalition Council £25,000? Once again, I have to say these car parks will not provide suitable access to York City Centre for many disabled residents and visitors who are unable to walk more than 50 metres or less. More benches will only mean that some disabled people will get drenched and cold on rainy days and in winter, and also benches won't help them to carry their necessary medical devices and shopping. No end of drop curbs or shuttle buses will help everyone. To put it simply, this Liberal Democrat Green Coalition is still continuing to exclude and discriminate against disabled people who are blue badge holders from the extended foot streets. Parking in these streets allowed us access to the city. There were only ever small numbers of people parking there, as you can see if you look at the Martin Higgett report. This situation has, as you can also see from the thousands of comments on the Reverse the Ban postcard, led to and continues to mean ongoing social isolation, misery, discrimination and anger. And I'm amongst those people. This Lib Dem Green Coalition-led council need to consult other cities such as Chester, Bath, Kent and Freiburg in Germany. Other ancient cities and find a solution and policies that allow it to keep the population safe, but doesn't exclude disabled people. Ring up Freiburg. They speak really good English. Have a chat with them about what's going on there. They seemed incredulous that we weren't allowed in the city centre when I phoned them. Look at ANPR technology. Use your imagination. Disabled drivers are not excluded from London. All disabled citizens and visitors have a right to use the banks, post office, dentists, cinemas, shops and restaurants and services that this great city offers. And as Jim mentioned, I have only been into York a handful of times now, maybe 5 times, when I went in several times a week. In the last 2 years, I've just not been able to go into this town where I was born and brought up. I'm afraid this is woeful ignorance and stubbornness of the Lib Dems and Greens to understand their duties under the Equality Act renders them liable to legal challenge and further unnecessary costs when they will have to compensate those disabled people who are being discriminated against on an ongoing basis and remedy the situation anyway. It's never too late to admit that you've got this wrong and to do a U-turn. If the government can do it over national policies, and come on, Lib Dems and Greens, who hold the power on this council, reconsider your discriminatory practices. Open up the extended foot streets. Let us use our main post office, banks, dentists, opticians. Let us spend our money in the shops and restaurants of York, and let our older disabled citizens go and meet their friends in the St. Sampson's Centre. Let us meet our friends in City Screen and see films in our outstanding accessible cinema right in the middle of an exclusion zone. Please let us back into our city.
Thanks very much, Jane. So I think the way that I want to run this next part of the meeting then, we've obviously heard some first-hand testimony there. We've got officers present, and I think it's going to be really helpful for us to just try to dig down a little bit into what's going on here, try to understand a little bit about what's being planned, what the impacts have been, and I think it certainly seems to my mind that we need to have a clear sense by the end of that of where things perhaps haven't worked as they were expected to have worked over the past year, where things are going forward, and I think, you know, we as a committee can think about how we can be constructive in terms of what we might like to suggest to the exec member who's present, to the executive as a whole, whether this is something that we wish to take back to full council. And so there's various things that I'd like you to have in mind as we're thinking about it. There's also 2 parts to this evening's discussion, I think. There's obviously the access strategy that's here before us, the access plan and the various updates on there. We have then obviously received this petition as well, and there's a schedule of petitions which gives us a few options in terms of how we choose to deal with that petition from this point forward. So I think what I'd like to do is start us out discussing the access plan, and I'd really like to encourage some sort of, you know, constructive discussion. Ask questions of the people who've got some lived experience, ask questions of the councillors who perhaps are not necessarily the direct decision makers on this particular topic, but are, you know, we're all of us here as people who can lobby and ask questions and apply pressure. Just in terms of how the meeting will work, I would like to make sure that everything comes through me as the chair. I'll do my best to try and make sure that everybody's brought in an appropriate way. If you signal that you want to speak by putting your hand up, I will write your name down on the list as a substantive new question. If you want to make a comment or an interjection on a point that's being discussed, if you can just sort of waggle your finger or do something to indicate to me that it's relevant to that particular thing, and where I can, I will try to bring you in. But I am conscious that we've got a lot of people around the table. There's a lot to sort of dig into as well. So I think you know, we'll see where we get to this evening and see how far through we can go. So I'm going to chuck it open. I don't know if people have questions. Well, Councillor Fenton never fails to be first with a hand up. So Councillor Fenton, over to you.
Vice Chair, I have the responsibility to get the ball rolling. Question for James and perhaps Pauline as well. In terms of we've heard about the list of items that the access officer will be involved in. Obviously, it's very disappointing that an appointment wasn't made sooner, so that those tasks couldn't start sooner. So it'd be helpful to understand what has held back the appointment of the access officer, and also to understand how the work of the MEMA consultant will hopefully complement the work of the access officer. I suppose what I'm looking for is an assurance that there won't be overlap or duplication of work, given that there is obviously a finite resource there. But if someone could pick up those 2 points, that'd be helpful, please.
Pauline, if you want to just answer to that, and sorry, just for the benefit of people watching, so Pauline Suchfield, and you're Director of Communities and Equalities, have I got that right? Customer and Communities, sorry, I always get the words a bit mixed up.
Yeah, can I start with an apology to everyone for the time it has taken to recruit an access officer. Where we started with this was we wanted to do it properly, and so spent quite a lot of time thinking about who we should go to, where the expertise lay, and where we could learn from best practice. So colleagues from stakeholders from the community, disabled community, were involved in that discussion, and they were able to put me in contact with the best practice authorities. And from those authorities, we were able to obtain job descriptions to make sure we absolutely had the first rate offer for an access officer. It was through talking to those best practice authorities that we felt that we had to really look at the content of the job description to make sure it attracted the right grade. So that took us some time. And actually, we were also thinking about the whole equalities at the agenda at the same time, because we want to wrap around this role, other officers that are involved in access, equalities and inclusion. And that's a particular strength of our new Assistant Director of Customer Communities as well. So that this person didn't feel as though that they were sort of standing on their own, being vulnerable. One of the questions we wanted to answer was where should they sit in the organisation? Should they sit within place and with the planners and with the designers, with the project managers, or should they sit centrally? And what should their role encompass, this wider equalities role or an access role? And our colleagues who we discussed this with, the York Disability Rights Forum, particularly were keen to ensure that we didn't make this role too big, too wide, and try to tackle other equalities issues on behalf of the authority, when actually we needed a real focus on access. So that was a really useful discussion. And actually I tore up the existing job description that I had, and we started from scratch and created it together. So that took us some time. We had to get it graded. Luckily it came out the right grade, which is quite a senior officer in the council. And then we proceeded with the recruitment process. Unfortunately, that recruitment process wasn't successful. So that was in the spring, early summer of this year. And that was a traditional process. And we were going to have an officer panel and a disabled residents panel involved in that process, but we didn't get to that stage. And we sought to speak to those that had shown some interest to find out why they hadn't ultimately put a recommendation, an application in. And they talked about that feeling of being maybe isolated, the role was too big. Did the community really want this role? So when we went into the second application process, we used a search agency to approach people to talk about the job. And also I was available to talk to about what we were putting around the role in the council. And actually we found people who were absolutely prepared to apply for the role, were excited by the role and hadn't seen it the first time round. So we were able to access expertise that we'd never even spoken to the first time round. And this time we designed the panel with disabled representatives and experts on the panel, working with officers instead of to one side of officers this time, and we've hopefully made an excellent appointment, and we're just in the final processes of making that appointment. So that's what's taken us the time, and my apologies that it has taken that long, but I think we've got the right results in the end.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Pauline. I think, Councillor Holly, was that a supplementary on this, or was it right? Sorry, I've got your name down. And Flick, I think you did have a supplementary on this point. Did you? Yeah. I just want to. Sorry.
Second part of the question, James wants to.
Yes, just to come back to
Sure.
the second part of the question, which was about the appointment of MEMA as access consultants. So executive in July, having heard some of those challenges, actually said we want to accelerate some bits of work quickly because they are urgent, recognising that, and they agreed to the appointment of some consultants to do 3 pieces of work, which was around the pavement cafe licenses, and it was around the car parks, and it was around the seating aspect. So those 3 bits of work they asked us to take forward. The first piece of that is close to concluding around pavement cafe licenses, and there were 2 bits to follow. Part of their commission will absolutely be a handover to the access officer of this is the work we have done, these are the lessons we've learned, these are the important things to consider going forward as you, for instance, develop the York standard, and these, so that learning continues through.
Okay, thank you. I will bring you in a minute, Flick. The thing that I just wanted to pick up with you, Pauline, that I don't quite understand from that, because I understand all of that thinking around appointment of an access officer, and I don't think anybody would dispute a lot of what you've said there. However, I don't understand why a year ago we were basically told that one of the main mitigations of this was that we would have an access officer. And I, from what you're saying, it sounds as though the thinking about what that access officer might look like only began after we removed the exemption. And a large part of the discussion that we had in scrutiny was around the timing of the removal of the exemption. And certainly I'd put forward a proposal that we shouldn't be making anything permanent until we had mitigations in place. So I just want to be clear that that discussion, all of that description that you've given there around the access officer and the appointment, all began after the November the 18th decision. And if it didn't, I just don't get how it can have taken more than a year to appoint somebody to a role.
The work that I started was after Christmas, that same year.
So you began the work on this after Christmas of 2022?
Yeah.
Right.
2021.
Sorry, Christmas 2021. So in January 2022.
Yes.
So 3 months after the decision was made, or 2 months after the decision was made, you began work on drawing up what a job description might look like, and then all of that process that you've just described.
Yes, it didn't come really. We had various discussions about where the post should sit and who should lead on it, and where the capacity would be, because we were creating a new role, and I had to think about the structure of where that role would sit. So rather than just, advertising a job and sitting somebody on their own in an office somewhere, that wasn't going to be appropriate. So there was some bigger design work.
I think that's absolutely valid, and I utterly, I'm not disputing the description that you've made. I'm just concerned that we as a committee in October 2021 we're talking about one of the principal mitigations being that we had this access officer, this post was being created, and actually work wasn't underway at that point, and work didn't get underway immediately, and then it's taken all of this time. It's an observation. It's not something for officers to because you do what you need to do when you're told. Yeah, no, I get that.
We wanted to do this.
Sorry, that sounded like a teacher, didn't it? You do what you need to, you understand what I mean, yeah. Flick, I think you wanted to make a comment on that.
I was involved.
You just need to pop your microphone on.
I was involved in the creation of the access officer post and was involved right up until the interviewing for the second recruitment process. And sadly, I had to withdraw from that because it became too difficult with my own legal situation with regard to the council. But I did work with Pauline and the Communities Directorate in writing up the job description. And when we actually got to the point of no applicants had been received with the first attempt to recruit, Joe, as in head of communities, asked me to do some research within the industry as to why people didn't apply. And I've actually found the report that I wrote here. Basically, it contains things like it's a bad political situation. The blue badge ban has got the council a bad reputation regarding access. Nobody wants to work where they can't bring about real and meaningful positive change. Members have made very discouraging comments to the press. A specific candidate I had considered applying, but I felt I would struggle with the political situation, comments from elected members. So I think, you know, elected members do have to take some responsibility for the fact that, you know, their decisions have in fact delayed the very process of getting us, you know, to the point we are now. But I very much welcome the fact that we have now recruited an access officer and look forward to their starting, because they will very much be supported by all the disabled community in the city.
That's great. Thanks. That's helpful feedback. And I think, you know, again, something for us all to consider in terms of the messages that we send out as a council. Just one final point on this then, I don't know whether you can tell me this or not in terms of confidentiality or not, but have they now got a start date? Do we know what the start date is for that?
There's just one or two final hurdles to just finalise. We do have a draft start date, but I wouldn't want to say it without, you know, get everybody's hopes up for a certain date. And then,
but they do have a start date.
They know what that is. It's subject to one or two more processes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I now have Councillor Norman. You were next with your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, and just further comment on that. I think, to an extent, it's frustrating to see in this report so many items having a sole action owner as the access officer and not a kind of slightly more an approach that would perhaps see access as at the heart of being dealt with by everybody. But I wanted to ask a couple of very short, brief sort of qualitative questions, if that's all right, of officers. The amount being invested for benches is earmarked as an amount on there. I was kind of wondering how many benches that would be. And I know we were talking about vehicle access, and I appreciate this might be a question that you have to go away and look at, but I wonder how many vehicles are currently accessing the city centre during the Foot Street hours at the moment.
So in terms of the benches, I think we've got a nominal 15,000 down from memory in advance of the initial work being undertaken. I'm guessing, but that would probably get you somewhere between 50 and 20 benches is my estimation, as a guess. In terms of vehicles accessing the foot streets, we removed the vast majority of the exemptions. I can't remember exactly when the decision session was, last year at some point. So we removed all those exemptions. There is still some abuse going on that is enforceable as a moving traffic offence by the police. The council don't have powers to enforce that. Once permanent measures go in, obviously that abuse is stopped by the measures being in place.
So I will come back to you, Councillor Norman, as a supplementary, but just on that point then. So we currently have a situation where vehicles are able to access the city centre during the foot street hours that shouldn't be there.
Some vehicles abuse the system and remove bollards that are in place and drive through. Yes.
So if I'm a terrorist and we've just got all of the blue badge holders outside of the city for the last year and a half or 2 years or however long it's actually been in practice. But if I want to, I can just drive into the city centre at the moment.
At the moment, we have never said we have anti-terrorism measures in place at the moment. They come in place for the Christmas markets.
No, I'm just going to stop you there, Jane. Apologies. The key point that this scrutiny committee spent hours going over and that was discussed in detail at executive was around why the exemption needed to be removed immediately when so many other vehicles could access the city centre. That was the key point. And the proposal I put forward from this committee didn't actually challenge the need to remove an exemption. It was about not even going there until we were happy that the number of mitigations that were being proposed were actually in place. But the reality appears to be that very little of the mitigations have been put in place a year on. And what you're saying to us now is that vehicles can abuse the system and can get into the city centre. I don't understand how if the reason was a counter-terror measure, that was the main reason it was put forward at executive, was a counter-terror. It doesn't make sense to me. Could you?
Well, as I say, the police have taken steps against vehicles that they consider a risk. So but the definition of the rules means they can police those measures now. Without those rules in place, they couldn't police them. So the fact that those rules are now in place allows them to go, we're going to deal with that vehicle. And there was a front page splash on the vehicle. They did deal with a suspect vehicle because there were rules in place and they could identify vehicles that they thought were a risk.
I'm quite staggered, to be honest. I will probably just process that and come back with another question on that. But I know Councillor Norman had a supplementary as well.
Yeah, sorry. So we have no exceptions to there was an absolute no car at all is allowed, no vehicle allowed at all during foot street hours. That's what I heard you say.
We removed, I can't remember the exact detail, we removed most of the exemptions. So we removed exemptions for things like bullion vehicles, we removed exemptions for the fish van, we removed exemptions for the post office. So we removed all those exemptions.
I'm sorry, James, I was in town at 2 o'clock on Saturday and there was a protest going on and the protesters had to move out of the way for a post office vehicle. That was in St Helens Square.
Yep.
But you're telling me that they shouldn't have been there and that their exemption was removed. So how did they get into, because it's a one-way system, so they will have left down Lendal. We've already had a conversation about whether or not terrorists obey one-way streets or not. That was raised by one of the public speakers. But they must have come in somewhere as well.
Yes, they probably did, and they probably lifted a bollard. But just to be clear, as I say, the police enforce the rules as they are at the moment. The whole purpose of the hostile vehicle mitigation measures is that they are a total enforcement measure. That's the whole purpose of them.
Okay. So I saw James just flagging as I think a supplementary. Councillor Norman, I think you've still got a supplementary as well. Sorry, I'm calling you James. Jim. Sorry. I'll come back to you.
There is a way to get medical emergency vehicles in that aren't blue light vehicles. There is a way to get from memory if there's a major water leak and Yorkshire Water need to get in, or there's a gas leak. So there is a way to get exemptions in, but there aren't regular standing exemptions.
So, and I will come to you, Jim, in a minute. So just for total clarity then, the only vehicles that we should see within the Foot Street area during the operating hours are blue light vehicles or a sort of service or utility vehicle attending an emergency situation.
I think from memory, the only exemption that remained was the litter vehicle. I think there is an exemption for the litter bin emptying vehicle to access because we haven't got capacity in Silver Street works to keep all the litter from that the city and the market generate for the full 10:30 till 5 p.m. So I think that's the only exemption, thinking about it, that remains.
So that would be a council vehicle.
That'd be a council
access that. And I presume that we vet all of our council. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a second that any of our council officers have any tendencies, but I presume that we have a vetting process because the police advice was that, you know, some terrorists wouldn't pay attention to a blue badge and they might get one and get in, and therefore we should get rid of all blue badge holders. So no council officer, we would be vetting people to make sure.
We're working with counter-terrorism about how we implement a vetting process more extensive than we currently do. So we currently do a license check process, and the police can flag on that license check process. What we're looking at is a step beyond that in terms of a security.
So that's
check
another
as
thing
part
that
of
will
the-
come in. It's not something that's currently in.
It's something we are currently literally discussing with the counter-terrorism unit at the moment.
I'm trying to be constructive here, but I'm staggered. Really? What are we doing? We've exempted, I mean, we've got hundreds of harrowing comments. We've heard hundreds of people speaking to us. We've all sat and listened to really difficult testimony about what the impact of this blue badge ban has had. And then what you're telling me is that there's a ton of different ways in which, if you wanted to, you can get into the city centre. It totally blows a hole in the idea of it being a sterile zone. And we haven't even got into questions about whether or not it should or shouldn't be a sterile zone.
As I say, I don't think we've ever said it is a sterile zone without the measures in place.
Right. And if it's not a sterile zone, then the legislation is really clear that you shouldn't be exempting all vehicles from a sterile zone. The hostile vehicle mitigation, there's a really nice document, Centre for Protection and National Infrastructure, which was published by the government, has the shambles on the front page. It's really clear. It's important that our surroundings remain open and inclusive, and that the addition of physical security measures designed to protect us are integrated and proportionate to the assessed threat.
And it was CPNI and counter-terrorism unit that advised the executive.
That's not what's in our papers. It's not CPNI in our papers, is it? It's a North East counter-terrorism unit.
Well,
the superintendent has said publicly on record that there's no specific threat to York, and that it's on the local authority to provide us with risk assessments based on their national advice.
The counter-terrorism unit North East advised executive. CPNI were advised North East counter-terrorism unit, and came to York and met with the counter-terrorism unit and officers of the council at that site. The counter-terrorism unit and CPNI then briefed the executive, as we committed to at the executive meeting. So they came and presented in private of the risks and the risk assessment that exists for York.
But that was after the 18th of November, was it?
Yes, I think it was an action that came out of executive that they wanted a regular briefing.
Because I had a senior officer confirm on the 25th of November that no briefing had taken place, and that it would be helpful for decision makers to better understand the situation. But the decisions had already been taken at that point.
Well, as I say, I think it came about, I think it was Councillor Waller raised it at the executive that they would like a regular briefing on this, and that's what we committed to do after that request.
You do understand how this is all completely upside down and back to front. Apologies, everybody. I realise I'm hogging the chair here, but I'm just trying to process this a little bit. We've removed all of these people. We haven't applied an exemption across the whole city. We've got people who can access the city centre whenever they apparently want to. You're telling us that it isn't a sterile zone, and yet we've caused all of this.
So it's a sterile zone by rules. The council doesn't have powers to enforce that sterile zone until the physical measures are in. It's a police enforcement, it's a moving traffic offence. The council doesn't have the ability to enforce moving traffic offences.
Okay, I'm going to try and get us back on track. I'm apologies to everybody for that, but it felt needed. Councillor Norman, you had asked a specific question. Are you happy that you've had an answer to your specific question?
I'm very concerned for the safety of the people of the city, but yes, sadly.
Okay, thank you. So I then had Councillor Hollier, but I did see Flick waving. Was that as a supplementary or was that as a substantive? On this subject. Okay, Councillor Hollier, I will come to you, and I see Jim flagging as well. So Flick.
Yeah, so obviously the exemptions for other vehicles was supposed to start from the 1st of October. So as someone who's in the foot streets, you know, almost every other day, I looked to see if I could see any discernible difference in terms of fewer vehicles than previously. I can honestly say there is none. One day last week at 1 o'clock, I took pictures of 4 vehicles within the space of 10 minutes, basically doing a circuit round Tony Street, Davygate, round down into Parliament Street. There was one bullion vehicle, one DPD vehicle, and then 2 white transit vans of, you know, indeterminate origin. And that was, you know, in Foot Street's hours, 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a weekday. So I just can't see the difference at all. I mean, in terms of Goodrum Gate, you have a single cone, but we are spending council taxpayers' money, are we not, for security guards to be on that? I mean, every time I've been past there, to be honest, I see them playing Candy Crush on their phone or whatever they're doing and leaning on the window. But we are paying for security and we're clearly not getting it because all these vehicles are getting in when they shouldn't be.
So I think there's probably a couple of points that I'm just going to go to the other supplementaries, and then if officers could just bear in mind, it would be useful to clarify what the current security arrangements are in terms of whether there are staff barriers and what the arrangements are for the staff barriers, and also what we're doing to ensure that the changes that came in as of the 1st of October are being adhered to, and if they're not being adhered to, what we're doing about making sure that they do get adhered to, if that's the route that we're continuing to go down in terms of the policy that we're adopted as a council. Jim, I think you had a comment to make as well.
Yeah, I would just add that I was in a meeting in St Sampson's on behalf of the council actually on Thursday, came out at about 12:30 and walked from St Sampson's down to the Theatre Royal, which is not a great distance. There was Fogg's Floors in whatever the street is that's got Betty's in, and there were 2 builders vans where one of the guys just lifted the bollards going into Blake Street, and that was 12:30 in the day. So, and it's not rare. I mean, I've seen that many times. Unlike Flick, I don't go around taking photos of them because I don't take photos, but there you go. But could I just raise one other little question, which I maybe because I'm getting older,
Jim,
my hearing's not as good.
Just before you do, is it on this point? Or
Well, it's on the other point that Mr. Gilchrist mentioned, which is that
on the benches.
On the benches.
Can I just hold you on that for a second? I'll bring you back in a bit. I just think while we're on this topic, let's just finish up on this topic and then we'll move on to the next bit. So, Councillor Musson, I think you were wanting supplementary.
Thanks, Chair. It was just on the point where you said that people breaking these rules is currently being enforced by the police as a moving traffic offence. I think we've established by the sightings of numerous vehicles that the consequence for that is not immediate, if any, and they're not going to happen right that instant. So at this present time, if a terrorist tries to use a vehicle to attack York, they will not be stopped by any means before they have the chance to do some damage. So what is the benefit right now of excluding tomorrow blue badge holders from the foot streets when that could happen tomorrow?
No, that's it in terms of supplementaries.
Okay, so so in terms of the questions then, the police enforcement, as I say, only the police can enforce a moving traffic ban. The ban of vehicles from the city centre is one part of the police's counter-terrorism strategy. They have a number of others, some of which I know about and some of which I purposely don't know about. So, you know, I can't comment for the police on what their approach is. I can only take their advice, which, as I say, is contained within the papers. We do know there is abuse of the existing rules and we do pay for some security. Now, it's not static on every gate or every entrance point. There is some roving security that does deal with abuse of those access points. As I say, when the permanent measures are in place or even when the temporary measures are in place, that will be a lot easier to police, and they are fully staffed in terms of the temporary measures.
And to Councillor Musson's point.
Well, as I say, I can only respond with the point I made that the police advice was the police advice, that's what they wanted in terms of the counter-terrorism response.
Okay, I'm gonna quote you, Council. I'm gonna quote you, Mark Khan, because I think it's really pertinent. We have had permission from him to say this publicly. It's in the public domain. It's already been in the public domain. He says the driver for the counter-terrorism measures in York come from a national strategy rather than any specific threat assessment relating to York. As such, I am not aware of any specific threat assessments relating to York that would not be contained in any of the publicly available documents produced by the council. So can you tell me where in the council documents, where in our risk assessments, what you're saying is backed up by? Because this is the police officer that came to the executive meeting that talked extensively about the need to protect the Christmas market, which is one small part of the city centre.
I can't.
And yet we seem to have closed off a whole swathe of the city centre based on police advice, which the police themselves are saying is not specific to York and requires York to do assessments, and that those assessments should be in the public domain. I've asked repeatedly for those assessments. I've never been provided with them, as far as I'm aware, and they're not in the public domain. We keep referring back to counter-terror advice.
The executive have received that advice. I can't answer for Mark Khan. I can't answer.
But he's named so sorry, I'm cutting you off across again. But in the annexes to this report, there are two what look to be emails. To be honest, I'm not sure whether they are, but the way they're written, they look to be emails. One of which specifically references Mark Khan as the specialist, specifically names him, which is why we went to him to ask for him to give us the information, and which is why he provided us with these comments.
Those two annexes, Annex C and D, were the annexes that were attached to the executive report last year that this committee saw and that executive saw last year. They're not new. They were what was presented to executive in helping them make their decision last year.
I understand that. This email supersedes that.
I haven't seen the email, sorry.
Point of order, Chair. I don't think that the officers can answer these questions, because I think these questions are for the police. I also want to just raise the point of order that we are on the action plan update. We are not scrutinising the decisions.
That
noted.
Page 59, Annex C was attached to executive last year. That's not new since executive. That's what executive and this committee saw this time last year.
I'm aware of that. Yeah. Yeah.
And on the back
it was disputed at the time, wasn't it?
And on
we
the
were
back
told
of it,
that there was further information and that wasn't forthcoming. I'll take the point that Councillor Pearson's made. I think we'll agree to disagree on that, but I'm sure it's something that we'll want to return to. Councillor Fisher, was yours a supplementary on this?
Exactly on Mark Khan's statement to the executive, which I have watched probably 100 times now, and I've dissected it. He also said there is a credible threat. The terrorist threat is substantial, and the threat attack was foreseeable. And those are things that are absolutely critical to any security considerations within York. When people say it's a credible threat, it's foreseeable, and you don't take action against it, then you're putting the council at risk of enormous reputational and damage, and you're putting the people of York in danger. And that's something that we need to take into account. He was unequivocal. He said these mitigation measures should be brought in years ago.
I've also watched that. I noted those points. That's why we sought clarity. He was very clear that it's a national threat, no specific threat to York. He was absolutely fundamentally clear on that. I've also done quite a lot of asking for how the assessment was made that this particular area ought to be a sterile zone, but the bridges in York, for example, or the front of the Minster or other areas were not considered to be of that nature, because the problem is when we start chucking around the sorts of comments that you're making there, and we heard a lot of discussion around Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, the right to protect life, all of those sorts of things. There is a lot of general acceptance that actually you cannot make points based on these single big issues. You have to weigh things really carefully. And one of the key things that was raised by the Human Rights City Network which is the standard thing across any sort of human rights work, is that actually you can't take the rights of a minority and reduce them in favour of a majority. That's not how the Human Rights Act works. So you can't put Article 2, the right to protect life, above Article 8, the right for to be able to go about your daily business. And that point was proven at the High Court very recently in a dispute with Westminster Council, who did a very similar thing to this. They prevented somebody from accessing their house through counter-terrorism measures, and they happened to live near the Albert Hall. And there were a number of exemptions made for vehicles accessing the Albert Hall, but the person who had a blue badge was not allowed an exemption. And the High Court ruled that the council in that occasion had misapplied the Human Rights Act, had misapplied their public sector equality duty, and that was actually overturned. So I do think that we're onto quite dodgy territory if we start to sort of say, we've been warned, what if? Of course nobody wants there to be, nobody wants there to be any sort of a terrorist attack. But the point is that that one-off explosive, however it happens, terrible thing that we don't want to happen is having an enormous impact on at least 2,700 people that we see evidenced by the petition, plus the other 7 or 8,000 residents of York who hold blue badge, blue badge holders, plus everybody else. That's the nub of this discussion, or where the debate was. But as I say, I will go back to Councillor Pearson's point about not going back over that decision at that. When we come to discuss the petition, though, which is specifically on that point, which is why I've allowed the territories to drift into that territory, it is relevant, I think. So, Jim, you had a question about benches. Rather than letting you put a question, because I have just been advised that we just need to be a little bit careful about stakeholders questioning officers and versus councillors questioning officers, just in terms of what we are and aren't allowed to do within the framework of this committee. I think I'm going to try and guess the question that you're going to ask. Tell me if I'm wrong. James or Dave, I think we just wanted a bit of clarity over the £15,000 budget for benches and whether it was really correct that that would only deliver between 15 and 20 benches. I suspect that the answer will be that a bench costs about 500 quid and the installation cost is about 500 quid. No, they're standard benches. We as ward councillors often are quoted around sort of £1,000 to £1,200 to install a bench. So I'm guessing that that's probably the reasoning.
I don't have any facts and figures. That was based on, a bit like yourself, Councillor Crawshaw, my best guess based on that. What I would say is that benches in the city centre are even more complicated than other areas of the city, that they are generally fitted in a way that they can be moved for certain events. So they are, sockets are put in the ground. So rather than being fixed to the ground, they are have a removable socket engineering solution, so they can actually be moved around and relocated for instance, we've moved some for Christmas markets, for instance, and we relocate them to other areas in the city centre. So it's like you, based on experience and the best guess, made on the hoof. But I think it's probably pretty close.
Yeah, it doesn't sound out of the ballpark that I would expect from that amount of money. Councillor Musson had a supplementary. Was yours a supplementary on this? No. Councillor, I've got you.
Just a comment on the cost of installing benches, because we just put some in, and clearly the cost will be more significant if you have to put. We cost us about 500 quid, but if you have to remove them, it would add to 300. So 15 to 20.
Thank you, Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. I was actually going to ask a substantive question about benches, my favourite topic, but I can shoehorn it in as a supplementary. It was just about whether the installation and sort of product choice of benches is going to be something that you're going to engage in co-production in, because in a lot of cities around the world, I'm not suggesting that we currently do it, but they try and engage in hostile architecture to discourage, homeless people sleeping on them, but they often have a knock-on effect on disabled people, because these benches are designed to be uncomfortable and they don't provide respite, which is arguably the point that they're there for. So it's just, if we could get an assurance that if we're spending this much money on places to sit, we make sure that they are going to be actually benefiting the people putting them in for.
Yeah, apologies if I wasn't clear in my presentation before. It is absolutely about the location and design of those benches.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move us on to a new substantive question, and next on my list is Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. I had one very quick question, I hope. A couple of questions which have come up from the public speakers, which just sort of jumped out to me that I think would be useful to get some clarification on. And then if I'm allowed, one more substantive question. So I guess the very quick question is, are the permanent measures that we're putting in essentially in a few months' time, the route through which we solve a lot of these problems of vehicles abusing the system? And those are the measures that every single party, as far as I'm aware, on City of York Council actively supports.
Yeah, so those permanent measures they're very designed as hostile vehicle mitigation measures, absolutely enforce the rules. So that's exactly what they're designed to do. They're designed to be absolutes. You can't get past unless you're permitted to pass. So that's absolutely the intention. Obviously, based on the security advice, based on the police advice, the operation of those is for politicians to determine over time. So if terrorism risk reduces or increases, the way they operate can be reviewed in the same way any traffic regulation order can be reviewed and changed over time.
Thank you. And then just a couple of questions from public speakers have said. I think something, could you explain a bit about the one-way street, wrong way?
Yeah, just to reassure, when the permanent measures go in, there will be no way to drive the wrong way down a one-way street to get access.
Okay. I don't know, it's about what Councillor Kilbane said about a whole host of vehicles, but I think you've clarified that's actually a very limited number. And then James, sorry, I didn't get a second name, about Chester, Bath, Ghent, etc. Have we looked into those?
Yeah, I mean, we have met with those both at a senior level, at my level, but also at the operational teams have met with both of those cities. I don't think we've met with the German one, if I'm honest, but we've certainly met with Chester and Bath. Obviously, we've shared experience and expertise and the solutions they have found and the solutions we have found, and we've shared that experience. The approach has developed in response to those very productive conversations. Obviously, the advice and the geography dictate to a certain extent what solutions are or aren't possible. But yes, I can assure you we've met with both of those cities.
Okay, I did have a substantive one beyond that, or I can save it for later.
Do you want me to put you down on the list again for another substantive, and we'll
back on the bottom.
try and keep it moving around. Thank you. I'm just going to note that Bath and Chester both, I believe, have CCTV sliding access panels to allow access into their city centre, don't they?
They have the same measures we are installing, the slide-in bollards with CCTV, yes.
So disabled access is available at a variety of times during the day?
Bath has a route through where a limited access is through. So they've got a sterile zone with a route through the middle of it. You can't go off that route, but you can park on that route. So their geography, and this is what I was talking about before, their geography allows them that solution. Chester has something similar, which is a car park, which it allows access to. Yeah. But there are other bits which you absolutely cannot access in both those cities.
So a route through, like, for example, from Blake Street through Parliament Street and out at the other end into Piccadilly.
And the way they've achieved that is by putting a line of security measures down to protect those zones. So you'd end up with a line of bollards along the pavement edge all the way through on both sides of the road, and you would end up with sliding bollards or gates at each of the turn-ins off that route during Foot Street hours. So it would be very infrastructure heavy to make that solution work in a York context.
I would dispute that, because the advice and the guidance from CPNI is that you can have access points at the start and end of zones if you're verifying who's accessing those zones. And I believe that that's what happens in some of these other cities, is that people are asked to show their blue badge, which I think has a photo ID on it. It certainly has a lot of information that's held by the local authority to verify that blue badge. And then that is what enables them to access the zone.
We don't have, there's no national database for blue badge. So I can't verify blue badge holders. Just for clarity, I can't do that. They do ask them to show their blue badge to get through, but they still have measures to protect those footways and busiest areas of their city centre. Yes, they have a gate at each end to let them through, but they still have measures.
Okay, thank you. And a supplementary from Councillor Hollier.
And presumably just having an entry and exit either side defeats the whole object of having a sterile zone. If you're letting people with cars in, that's the whole point of the measures that are being introduced. And just secondly as well, in terms of that Chester solution, is there an idea of how much extra that would cost if we were to implement the full?
No, having been told off for guessing the price of a bench, I'm really not going to go near guessing that price, if I'm honest. But yes, you're absolutely right. Just the gates at the end don't work. That's why they have got extra measures where they come off. The other thing about the Bath example is that it's a relatively quiet street through their main streets. It's not the busiest street like it would be in York through Parliament Street, for instance.
Councillor de Gorn, I'll bring you in as a comment, but I'm just going to be really clear on this. The government advice on streetscape options. First option is total traffic exclusion, no vehicles allowed. The second one out of a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different options that get increasingly worse. But the second one is controlled vehicle inclusion, some vehicles allowed. And it's really, really clear. I do really advise you to go and look this up. It's a piece of government advice that came out in advance, March 2021, sets out what you can and can't do to try and grapple with some of these really difficult things that we're all trying to grapple with, because they are really difficult. But we're being presented with fairly black and white answers at the minute, I think. Councillor Hollier, if that's a supplementary, you can have it. And then Councillor Norman, I think you had a supplementary.
But presumably the solution you choose depends on the context of your streets. If it's a pedestrian street that happens to be incredibly busy with thousands of people, you're going to go for a stronger measure than you are on a side street or a very quiet street.
Absolutely, but we've done both of those things in York, haven't we? We've closed off quiet side streets as well as busy city centre streets. But the point of this is about busy city centre streets. That is specifically what the advice is for. So I do advise everybody to go and look it up and have a read of it and see if you're comfortable that the solutions that we've had presented to us are the right solutions for the city. That's all I'm going to say. Councillor Norman.
Thank you. Yeah, this all feels very slightly surreal because I think we're basically just going over the Martin Higgin report again, aren't we, really? But I just wanted to clarify, really, Councillor Hollier, are you saying that we cannot give access to the city centre because it will be too expensive to put that many barriers at the place?
I just asked how much it would cost. It's obviously for the council to determine whether or not that, in the context of everything else it's got to pay for, is an appropriate use of money. We're spending £3.5 million.
So it's not an appropriate use of money for these people to be able to use the city centre.
I just asked how much money it would cost. Our overriding concern is the safety of the public. That's the main issue.
Okay, and Councillor de Gorn, I think you wanted to make a comment, and apologies, I didn't come to you.
Yes, it was just to say that I have had a similar conversation with counterpart in Bath to find out a little bit more, understand, what parallels there might be, and it is quite a different geography, as I understand from the information that was shared with me. It's perhaps more analogous, if people know Sheffield, to providing a route across the moor, where the busiest pedestrianised street goes at right angles to the route which allows vehicle access, and there's counter-terror measures at each, as a crossing point. It's physically crossing the access route rather than being part of a fairly narrow, very busy pedestrian area, which is what the 2 loops were that were previously allowed for blue badge access into the city centre. So and as has been said, if you think about the geography and think back to the first temporary Christmas measures we had in place, we had a barrier line right across the middle of St Helens Square to enable that secure loop to exist without access to the rest of the square, and the same would apply to King Square if you were to want to provide vehicle access on the previous alignments that existed. So just sort of to illustrate that particular point. I think it's also just whilst I'm speaking, acknowledge the very serious concern about access, but I think there have been certainly some of the comments that have been made, unfortunately, do reflect the fact that the situation that exists is misunderstood by some blue badge holders. The reference to my site York, people not being able to access the city centre. My site York, unless you've moved recently, is not within the Foot Streets area. Yeah, so just, you know, for clarity, but people talk about a blue badge ban as though anybody's been frisked as they come in to see whether or not they've got a blue badge. We are talking about vehicle access, which I fully accept. You know, some blue badge holders, that is essential for their access to close to premises, but it doesn't apply across the board. And I think that needs to be made clear. And as I said, reference back to the situation pre-2018, the advice we had from the police at that time was to implement the measures that we are now applying, but in 2 stages. And I personally felt that that was wrong, because at the time, the policy of the previous administration was a phased approach, which would allow the line across St Helens Square and King Square, but phase 2 would be to then say to a blue badge holders, I'm sorry, we're now pushing you further out from where the line would be. So, you know, that's a little bit of historical context for this decision, which predates the current administration, but we obviously have had to take it forward based on the police advice.
I'm just going to make a point, which I think is useful to have in mind there, and thanks for your comments there, Councillor de Gorn. I'm aware of somebody who is a blue badge holder who didn't try to access the city centre by car. They came in on the bus, and they came in with their walker, and they walked and they had a little rest, and they walked a bit more and they had a little rest, and they tried to go up a quite shallow curb. They fell backwards and they banged their head. They were quite shaken. They didn't need hospital treatment, but they were quite shaken. They were within the Foot Streets area. I think it was near Brown's, and I think staff from Brown's came out to help them. Nobody was able to get a vehicle into the area to be able to retrieve them, because even though they had a blue badge, the only vehicle that they could get in there was a 999 ambulance. And they were fine, actually. They were shaken. They felt a little bit funny, but they couldn't honestly say that there was anything that was a medical emergency. But they were basically stuck in the city centre. They ended up having to do a really lengthy walk with, I think, 2 members of staff helped them. Complete strangers. It's totally disabling. And that person has not gone back into the city centre again since then. And people who hear that story won't want to go into the city centre. And this is the point that I think the council is missing again and again and again. Blue badge holders and needing vehicle access, it's not just about the drive in and be right close to the place that you need to be, although that is hugely, hugely important. It's also about people having confidence to use the city centre. And what we've done has shattered the confidence of a whole host of people who would otherwise come into the city centre. And you know, when we think about passing that motion around, you know, the social model of disability, understand what that means. It's that sort of thing. It's about the barriers, whether they're physical or whether they're confidence or whatever they are, that are put in place. And that's what we've done as a council, I believe. Councillor Fisher, if that's a comment, you welcome.
Thank you. I just thought when I came here tonight, we're going to discuss the actual action plan to make sure that situations don't like that occur. And I'd really like to get back to that, because, you know, I think that's the critical thing. Let's make sure that disabled people can get into the city centre safely and have full access. That's what I want to get. Nobody wants to stop them getting in there. It's just how we get them in there. And that's what the action plan is all about. We should be concentrating on that.
Councillor Musson, I had you down for a substantive question. I think you possibly asked it about benches. Yeah. In which case, Councillor Fisher, I actually had you down for a substantive question, but I don't know whether that's something that you've raised. In which case, Councillor Fenton, a little while ago, you had a substantive.
Thank you. Just picking up on the point of access to the area, which is the extended restricted area. The action plan talks about work with dial and ride and shop mobility. Obviously, they are separate organisations. I just wondered what feedback we'd had from the engagement with those organisations as to the extent to which the interventions set out in the action plan have made or started to make some kind of discernible improvement in terms of knowledge of the service and people feeling confident in accessing the service. Because I think for everybody, if you haven't used the service before, there'll be some nervousness as will it meet your needs? So what feedback have we had either from users of the service or from those organisations? And then secondly, similarly on the issue of access to and through the area, you mentioned at the start a potential shuttle bus trial during Residents' Week in January. I just wondered what degree of confidence there is around that coming to fruition.
I'll take the second bit first, if that's all right, while it's in my mind. So the shuttle bus is there's a complication of running a bus service. So it needs to be registered with the Transport Commissioner. You need to do that so many days in advance. So we will not be running, just to be clear, a shuttle bus through the city centre. What we will be doing is getting potential users to come and tell us about buses and get different types of buses there that are manufactured so that they can say, this one would work for me, this one wouldn't. What does that mean? So trying to make sure that we understand that as a first step, that would then lead to a formal trial if executive approved it. So what we've said is we'll do the feasibility study first, but absolutely imperative to that feasibility is people's experience of the type of bus. And then we'll take a report to executive to say, do you now want to run a trial of this? There's a whole host of sort of questions that we can't answer on that about who is the bus service available to? So there's, is it just blue badge holders? Is it elderly people? Who is that bus service available to? That needs to work. That dictates to a certain extent the type of bus then that you provide. It also needs to get through, potentially into the foot streets, which is a tight area. So getting that balance right is why we want to do it in that phased way. In terms of the feedback from Dial-A-Ride and Shop Mobility, so some of the work and some of the funding went to absolutely helping them raise their profiles. So certainly that's what Shop Mobility talked to us about. Dial-A-Ride, they're sort of very excited at the moment because the new buses the council is funded are due to arrive any time now. So that is absolutely linking to their promotion of these new buses. How do they relaunch that service?
Supplementary, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you. Just on the shuttle bus kind of engagement, it sounds like, I think, and this you may already have this in hand, but I think before a bus appears in a public space in the centre of the city, I think it'll be important to be really clear, maybe through consultation with some of the advocacy groups, around the kind of needs you should be looking at, how different types of bus might address those needs and cater for all service users. So I think the more homework you can do before you do that, hopefully will mean you'll get the best possible outcome from that exercise, which I'm probably teaching you, probably got it all in hand already, but just don't miss the opportunity, because I'd hate for the bus a number of vehicles to turn up and then questions that are being asked are not necessarily the ones that that people want to give their feedback to.
I agree wholeheartedly with the comment. Everything in the action plan had been engaged with prior to it coming to scrutiny a year ago, apart from the bus shuttle, which emerged. So I'm acutely aware that that hadn't been engaged in the same way as the other bits of the action plan. So that's why we're very keen to make sure that that engagement happens in a phased and logical approach for exactly the reasons you've described, Councillor Finton.
And Flick, I think you wanted to make some comments on that.
So firstly, a question. I'm wondering, Chair, if we have any kind of timescale whatsoever around this feasibility study of the shuttle bus, because bearing in mind that we are already here a year after all these mitigations should have been done in an anticipatory fashion before the decision was made. And also shop mobility. I think, again, we're lacking sort of data and information about that. I personally went to speak to them and to my huge upset, I was told they had been instructed not to speak to me. So I don't know, I couldn't get any of my questions answered by them directly, but I was only seeking to ask them what their level of use was, whether they'd seen an increase in people using their services, a decrease, what they might attribute, you know, any of that to, because I'm acutely aware that in this cost of living crisis, nay emergency that we're in, using shop mobility, you know, comes at a huge cost. I suffered a breakdown of my powered wheelchair in the summer and found myself at shop mobility. Unfortunately, they didn't have a suitable piece of equipment that I could hire. But if they had have done, it would have cost me £20 for the day. Literally while I sought to get a repair for my own power chair. So I think we have to be really mindful that this is an option that, you know, has a cost implication, and in the situation we're in, that is prohibitive for many, many disabled people whose benefits are now under attack as well.
Thank you. I think that's certainly useful, and the cost of using shop mobility, I think, is something that we all need to bear in mind if we're casting it around as a solution. You know, there is an implication within it. I just want to clarify really quickly. So I think there was some questions there that Flick raised that we could perhaps go to shop mobility and look for some information around that if we could. That obviously won't be available this evening, but if that could be brought back to the circulated to the committee, if that's possible, that would certainly be helpful. I would just like to have an understanding of, because the points in the action plan here around shop mobility, I understood them both to be, one, to be something that would happen when the access officer was in post, and the other, the £10,000 one-off, was something that was to be undertaken once the fleet replacement was complete. So they both read to me as things that hadn't yet happened. So it'd just be helpful to understand what the timeline is on that. And then obviously, to Councillor Fenton's point around the feasibility of the shuttle bus, and the quite a number of stages of consultation that may well need to be gone through. Do you have any sense of whether that's something that might be, you know, months away, years away? I realise it's a difficult question to answer, but it'd just be useful to have a vague sense of timeline on that.
So the £10,000 investment in shop mobility has happened. That went out within a couple of weeks of executive last year. So that one has been done. The access officer one is obviously dependent on the access officer. So I think the important thing to remember about all these actions, some were actions that were dependent on funding, some were actions dependent on an access officer. So there's 23 actions in there, 6 of them are dependent on the access officer, 5 of them were dependent on funding, and 1 was cancelled by executive. Subsequently, I think 10 of them you can say are delivered. So I'm not saying that's fantastic or terrible. I'm just trying to put some facts and figures to the question you ask. In terms of the feasibility study for the bus study, the turnaround is relatively quick in terms of the initial assessment. So that should be completed by the end of this calendar year. As I say, we want to do the engagement and experience of buses in Residents' Week early next year. I think that's January. So we will be hoping to bring a report forward to executive, and this may get overtaken by events, but sort of March, April time, we would be starting to go. We have a report ready to go.
Okay, thank you. Next up on my list is Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, officers, for your action plan update. My question was around Castlegate, which obviously Mr. Cannon brought up. I just wondered, since it's been reopened, I think was it October it was reopened?
Yes, I think it was the end of September last year from memory, I think.
I just wondered if we had any information on how well it's been used by blue badge holders.
I don't have facts and figures in terms of surveys we've undertaken. So people around the table are probably just as qualified as me to comment. I have obviously walked down Castlegate to observe some of the changes. I would say it's patchy. I don't think it's, instinctively as busy as it perhaps was prior to COVID. But then the world has, the world's changed quite a lot since COVID as well. So, I don't have it. I don't have the answer is the honest answer.
Okay, thank you. Next on my list, I had Councillor Norman.
Thank you. I think this is more a question for people sat on this side of the room. And I will say I have a slight personal interest in that. I, walking through the city, have experienced quite a few significant problems with street license, cafe licenses, and in fact I haven't visited the city centre in quite a long time myself. I guess kind of it would be interesting to know what your experiences were if you have attempted to engage with kind of council enforcement structures, because obviously they should not be obstructing the highway. How has that been? And if you could talk more about that, that would be good.
Waiting for an answer to come up.
Sorry, I wasn't sure that was a question.
Sorry, I didn't think. Sorry, I think that was more a question for people with experience on the side of the room. That's right.
My apologies.
Do you want to?
I occasionally take a moment to look through. I don't know if anybody wanted to make comment on that. Flick.
So in terms of engagement with enforcement, well, haven't really got anywhere. I resorted to writing letters before action. I received correspondence on Fossgate because my particular problem there was that a cafe licence had been issued to Ambiente that obstructed the full width of the pavement, and of course the carriageway there is set going over the bridge. And of course, it's also not pedestrianised. And the response I received was that it's fine for pedestrians to be expected to walk on the carriageway because it is low traffic. And when I pointed out that it was difficult for me as a wheelchair user, to cross the road because of the lack of drop curbs, and also because you'll notice if you go across there, the Ambiente side, the paving on the footpath there has been redone, only to be covered in cafe furniture, and yet the other side has not. So I feel very much when I'm going across that right-hand side that it's actually the camber is tipping me into the road, so I don't feel safe doing it. So effectively, Fossgate was fully obstructed to me. I had to go, a very long way round. The response was it was fine for pedestrians to walk in the carriageway, including blind and visually impaired people with guide dogs. And if anybody wanted to stick to the footpath exclusively, they would need to cross the road 3 times in the length of Fossgate, and that would add 20 metres to their journey. However, I do know that since the cafe licenses automatically ended on the 30th of September and coming up for renewal on the 1st of October, Ambiente seems no longer to have one. But of course, as a member of the public, I'm not able to find that out. I've simply been down there 4 times when the business has clearly been open and full of people, and yet no cafe license, no cafe furniture. So I can only assume that their license was not renewed.
Councillor Fenton, I think you had a supplementary on that.
Yeah, it obviously the pavement cafe licensing work wasn't part of the action plan last year, but from what's happened since, I think it does form a quite an important part of, you know, it complements a lot of the things in here. I mean, is it from officer's perspective, do you now consider it to be a part of this kind of broader scheme of measures? Because although it obviously has a licensing, a separate licensing implications, it would seem sensible to me, at least, for it to be sort of referenced in here. I know this was a snapshot from the action plan last year, but does it sensibly sit alongside some of these other measures? Because obviously it's fine having drop curb, but if then the pavement is obstructed by inappropriate pavement cafes, then it rather defeats the object of the drop curbs.
So it is absolutely linked. It's absolutely linked to access to the city centre, and you know, I am probably on record as making statements, or certainly approved statements, that recognise that the pavement cafes that were introduced and the change in legislation that the government produced at the height of COVID, and the guidance we produced, now feels outdated and needs review. And you know, that's the council's position, which is why we're doing the piece of work we are with MEMA now. We have taken action to enforce against cafe businesses. So that is where they don't have the tapping rails that we require, or where they've caused such an obstruction on a highway where going into the carriageway would be dangerous. We've removed that cafe license. So I can think of at least 2 examples, where we have removed the cafe license because of complaints about having to go into the carriageway where we consider completely unsafe places for people to be in the carriageway. So yes, it's absolutely linked. I think was the essence of your question. I don't know whether I've missed. Just to confirm, that is on the forward plan for November's executive for them to consider that piece of consultation.
Just on that, I'm going to, I just want to ask you something just as a point of clarity. I'm just conscious of time, and just to let committee members know, what I'm planning to do is defer the 2 items that we have coming after this item. We've got an update on the budget setting process, which is pretty much what it is within the report, and something around scrutiny training, which is a fairly formality that can come to the next meeting in time for the budget. So my plan is to, sorry?
It's not training share, it's the research budget.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. My research budget, apologies. So we can deal with both of those items. My plan is, rather than to take an adjournment, to just run us till 8 o'clock and then hit a guillotine at 8 o'clock-ish. But if people do want to nip out for a comfort break, do feel free to. Just on the point of the cafe license, and I appreciate the way that, you know, national licensing was, or legislation was sort of brought in, and it was all very quick and very rapid. But the guidance that came in even then did say that where a pavement license is granted, clear access routes on the highway will need to be maintained, taking into account the needs of all users, including disabled people. And I think there is a feeling, certainly it's something that I've had picked up, it's in the comments from the petition, that those clear access routes haven't been maintained and the needs of disabled people haven't been taken into account. What have we done? What are we doing? What can we do to make sure that when we are issuing pavement licenses, they are actually appropriate for the location, taking into account the needs of all users?
where that is on a non-pedestrianised street, our guidance at the time, and I think it's still on the website somewhere, but is the thing we're consulting about changing, from memory said that where it's on Piccadilly, for instance, where you've got traffic, there must be a 1.5 metre gap between for pedestrians to traverse the footway. Now, where it is pedestrianised, we think that the way that is worded means that people can either traverse the pavement, the highway, or the pavement. So you can interpret that way. Now, I'm not saying that's right or it's wrong, but that's the way we interpreted it at that point in time. The experience now, and what I'm getting at, is the debate of, is that right? Is it right to say a cafe is, even on a foot street, a cafe is on the pavement and we want people to drop down onto the road and drop back up again? That is part of what the current consultation has been looking at, and in what circumstances is that appropriate and in what circumstances is it not appropriate. That was what the July exec report looked at in terms of things like the temporary ramps that Westminster's Disability Action Group were pushing Westminster to use. So it's those sorts of options that we want to look at and explore so that we can present to executive a new set of guidance that will have to look at those range of issues that are being experienced. What I do accept is there is a grey area between Piccadilly and a foot street, and Fossgate is probably the best example we've got of that, where traffic is very limited, but there is still traffic at what we would call a low traffic street. That is probably one where there is more debate to be had as well. So there are fully pedestrianised, fully vehicle, and there's an element of grey area on some streets as well.
So again, I think just in terms of, as we go ahead with that, I'm aware that the temporary ramps can be a problem for people with sight loss. I think that they're also notoriously bad for wheelchair users, actually, in terms of the stability and having a turning circle at the top, as it were. I'm not sure if that's quite the right terminology, but we have some very narrow pavements where there's actually very little room when you got up the ramp to then maneuver around. And certainly one of the issues that I've witnessed is people getting a certain amount of the way along a pavement, reaching a point where there's a cafe or whatever blocking their path. It's then quite difficult to turn around, and even if you have turned around, you've then got to go all the way back up to the point at which you access, and you may not be able to get back onto a pavement or a safe carriageway, even if you do go back.
Yeah, as I say, I hear what you're saying about the ramps, but the reason we are looking at particular ramps as I say, was that the Westminster Disability Group were saying these were a significant success, and we actually pinched the picture from their newsletter into the exec report that went in July. So I'm not saying they will work in York. I'm just saying they're an example that's been used elsewhere that we thought it was worth trying to explore all options. And the engagement that MEMA are doing is about exactly the points you make about trying to engage and understand whether it would or wouldn't work in a York context.
And just briefly on that, because you've mentioned MEMA, I know Councillor Norman's got a supplementary on this, but just on the consultation that MEMA are doing, are we clear on the terms of reference of that consultation and who they're speaking to and who they're feeding back to? Because I think that point has been raised.
I'm quite clear.
Okay. Could we have them?
I'm more than happy to share the brief and the engagement they've done and who they've reached out to, yes.
I think that would be helpful for us. Thank you. Flick, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I've actually come from part 2 of that consultation this afternoon. I couldn't attend the first one because I was sick with COVID. But before agreeing to do so, I asked for the terms of reference and what the commitment was to co-production. An answer came there, none really, but I decided on balance I would participate this afternoon. But unfortunately, we got to a situation whereby we were told that the MEMA access consultant had been back to the council to ask about co-production and writing the report jointly with us, and was told no, it had to be done by them as a third party. And because we disagreed with a lot of the points that were raised there, we said, you know, that sadly, whilst it was nothing personal, she needn't be surprised if we were publicly saying that we disagreed with it, because fundamentally, as I see it, it's an attempt to actually justify getting around government guidance. Now, I completely accept that it's a medieval city with narrow streets, narrow pavements. It's extremely difficult to do. You know, Parisian boulevards, our streets are not. But that means fundamentally something has to give, because previously we had footpaths for pedestrians, we had carriageway for vehicles, and now, because we still do have vehicles and are always going to have vehicles, because we've got to allow for emergency vehicles and the dial-a-ride bus and, you know, maybe other exceptions as well. So we're never going to get to this pedestrian-free Valhalla that has been spoken about, which means, you know, a lot of disabled people need to be on the footpath. Blind and visually impaired people use a technique called shorelining, whereby they use the line of the buildings to navigate where they are in the space, and they need raised footpaths to know that they're not in shared space. So removing curbs ultimately is not going to be the answer. There is currently a blind woman from the National Federation of Blind People UK who is going to judicial review about that. So that isn't going to be the answer. The temporary yellow roadwork ramps that are being presented as an option to be put every 50 metres to prevent the creation of islands whereby, you know, wheelchair users can't access is not a solution either, because I can't use them. They're very often too steep because the curves are so, you know, uneven and steep that you've got too much of a gradient. In my power chair, they're not stable enough, so I end up dragging the thing off the curb with me, potentially damaging my very expensive equipment that I don't have the money to replace. And it provides a trip hazard all the way along the road for blind and visually impaired people. So, you know, that isn't going to be the answer either. And that's what, sadly, I felt the consultation was trying to do, was to make exceptions and constantly get around the government guidance. I have every sympathy for cafe owners, you know, who had under the emergency powers, the situation of, you know, going out and buying all this furniture and enclosures and what have you, and then for them to be suddenly told, oh no, hang on a minute, actually you can't do this after all. Very, very difficult situation. And whilst I appreciate it all had to be done in a hurry, that's why there's pushback now, because they thought this situation was going to be permanent. And that is, of course, when, you know, many, many disabled people were isolating in any case. So it's a bad situation, and I have sympathy for businesses, but equally it's now providing a massive barrier in itself to the free movement of disabled people around the city.
Thanks, that's really helpful and useful, and I think it's something that officers do need to take note of, because if there isn't confidence in a consultation, then it becomes difficult if then the outcomes of that consultation are presented as.
I'll absolutely pick some of those early comments up from that. I appreciate the challenges, and they've been very well articulated, the sort of challenges around how you manage that footway, highway, footway space. But the comments about sort of objection to co-production and those sorts of things, I will pick up.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Councillor Norman, I think you had a supplementary on this, and Councillor Fisher, is that supplementary or a new?
Yeah, just kind of quickly, and more, I think, sort of a comment to executive that it seems on this, well, on all of these issues, isn't it really? Time is of the essence. We seem to have acted before we've mitigated yet again. And really, quite a simple solution to me seems to be that if there is a curb, then we shouldn't really have anything obstructing the pavement. That seems like quite a simple rule of thumb that resolves a lot of issues. If there are more things to be done above that, then great. But that as a simple beginning seems quite straightforward. And I think I would just urge that if we can remove as many obstructions of pavements as quickly as possible, then that really should be the goal, the name of the executive.
And I think that probably speaks to the point that Scott made however long ago about the A boards, that we as a council did accept that putting A boards on the pavement was a barrier. And if we believe that an A board is a barrier, then surely tables and chairs are just as much, if not more so. So I think it is something that we perhaps need to think about. I had Councillor Hollier down for a substantive from way back when. I think you had a second question, and then I've got Councillor Fisher, and I'm going to start noting the time.
Thanks, Chair. Just in terms of, since the hours reverted to 5 PM from 7 PM, is there any idea of the sort of additional blue badge parking happening in the foot streets in that sort of 5 to 7 period?
I haven't got figures to hand now. No, I think we are doing some spot checks. As again, people around the table may be better placed than I to comment on how well used it is or isn't being in terms of the sort of 5 till 7 parking.
Happy to have my enforcement officers do some work to bring that back to the committee chair.
I had one bit of anecdotal feedback on that actually, which may be useful to share, which was that it was very much welcome that it had been reverted to 5, that it meant that some people were now able to go in and visit a shop or a place. But the point was made quite strongly that that sort of half an hour window, or maybe an hour if you're lucky, particularly if it's a struggle to get in and out of a vehicle and those sort of things, really doesn't leave any time to do more than one job. And I don't know about any of you, but if I go into town, I generally save it up for 3 or 4 things so I don't have to keep going backwards and forwards. And so I think it's about finding things that are solutions that can enable, and certainly having some access back is enabling. But I think it's also about thinking longer term, what do we want from the city in terms of access? Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I was pleased to see the investment in Dial a Ride. Dial a Ride is popular with my residents, being one of the most remote large communities in York. A lot of people like Dial a Ride. How do we see it operating within the foot streets? Do we see it basically dropping off at 1 or 2 central locations, or do we see it actually touring around and dropping off where people request?
From memory, and officers might tell me otherwise, from memory, it has an exemption to enter at Blake Street. It runs up to St Sampson Centre and out up Church Street, Goodrum Gate.
Okay, what I would like to do now is just spend a very brief 5 minutes. I'm not going to do a really super strict 8 o'clock guillotine, but I want us just to move into a last little bit of thinking here. So we've obviously, there's quite a lot of conversation that's gone on there and quite a lot of things that we might want to think about. I personally don't like having meetings where we don't have some tangible outcomes from them. One of the things that we certainly need to make a decision on is what we want to do next with the petition that's been brought forward. And I'll give you the options that the petition schedule enables us to do with that in a moment. Just before I get to the petition, I'll just invite from members if there's anything that they've heard that they think that would be useful for us to either make recommendation to executive or executive members, or something for this committee or other committees to consider in any greater detail. Councillor Norman.
I think it would be useful to formally have stuff on pavement cafe licenses on the action plan. Even if that work is ongoing, sort of separate to that, I think it would be useful to have it included on the action plan. I'm not sure if that's a recommendation to the executive to put it on or to whoever, but I think that would be useful.
I think we as a committee can make that recommendation to the officers. So if everybody's happy that we make that as a formal recommendation, that we monitor the pavement cafe licensing as part of the access action plan. Are we all happy that we do that? If I can just see a show of hands. Yep, I think everybody's happy with that. So if you could do that going forward. Councillor Fenton.
Just another request or recommendation that we receive further updates. I'm relaxed as to whether it comes to this committee or economy in place. But I think if we can follow a pattern of an update coming to this committee around the same time as I imagine the executive member will want regular updates as well going to your decision session. But if we can try and align those two, I think that would be helpful.
I'd certainly be happy that we do that. I think probably it might be helpful for us to have it a bit swifter than another year's time. So whether we come back in 3 months or 6 months, either of those two is fine with me. 3? Yeah. So let's look at scheduling. We'll let you know the date of the meeting, and we'll pick that up within our work programming. Councillor Fisher.
Thanks, Chair. There's one little omission from the action plan that I can see, which is provision for those people who suffer from non-mobility or non-sight issues, people who suffer panic attacks, stuff like that, and how we can make the city centre a safer place for them as well.
Sorry, just repeat the last part.
How we can make the city centre a safe place for them, where they have places they can go if they're having a panic attack or an agoraphobic attack or need access to materials or something like that.
We might have to think about how we would include that on a action plan, but we could certainly have a conversation with officers about whether there was a way of finding a formulation that acknowledged that. I think it's a fair point and absolutely all part of access. James, do you want to comment?
That'd be a recommendation to exec to add it to the action plan.
Okay. In which case, are we all happy that we make a recommendation to executive? I'm going to have to try and find the wording for how we do that. Do you want to propose some wording of what we would recommend to executive?
The action plan is extended to cater for the needs of those with non-mobility issues.
That might open it right up.
Okay, I know what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to find the right wording for it.
What about if we ensured that non-visible disability or impairments were fully taken account of within the action plan?
Fine.
Does that sound reasonable? I'm kind of looking at stakeholders here as well, if that sounds reasonable as a form of wording.
I would just say that mobility impairments can be invisible too. So I think the word you're looking for is more like, I don't know. I think Councillor Fish was referring specifically to perhaps people that have neurodiversity or mental health problems. So I don't know if you want to be that specific, or you could just say non-mobility disabilities.
Okay.
Scott.
From the co-produced document that I produced with different disability charities, we arrived at people with sensory, physical and hidden disabilities was the wording in agreement.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah. Did you get that? Okay, so if I can just see a show of hands that we make that recommendation to executive. Is everybody happy? Yeah, fab. Any further thoughts from the committee? Councillor Hollier. Oh, apologies, I did have you down actually.
It's all right. Just in terms of that update, I think one of the things we've missed at this meeting that perhaps would have been useful is some representation from the police or counter-terrorism experts, and I wonder whether it would be useful to seek some attendance from them at that next update meeting.
We could. I think, to be fair, we didn't necessarily at the time anticipate going entirely down the route of the counter-terror, but if we want to look at that specifically at another time, I'd be very happy to do that. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks. You know, I think it makes sense in terms of what James said earlier, in terms at the very start about access measures being something that can be monitored like any other traffic regulation order year by year. So I think that probably makes sense that needs to be reviewed regularly in line with terrorism threats and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that the terrorism threat is probably done on a national basis, isn't it? So the threat level goes up or down. That I assume is reviewed internally anyway. I'm more than happy to have a conversation about terrorism in the city if we think that it's appropriate to come to this committee. Is that something that everybody would like to do? Councillor Musson?
I think given that we've established that any vehicle could enter the Foot Street zone at any time, and a marked van, that might be useful.
Yeah. Councillor Fenton?
Happy to have a discussion as long as we're clear about the context of that discussion.
That's sort of what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's you know, we can have a sort of theoretical discussion about where the terror threat might come from, and I suppose it might be helpful to discuss how a terrorism threat might manifest itself from we're talking about hostile vehicle attacks. Yeah, I mean, and we may be told, well, we can't tell you that because we can't tell you that in a public forum or whatever. So absolutely no problem with having that discussion, as long as we're clear about the context in which we're having it.
So perhaps the thing to do, sorry, I'm just going
Go
to
on.
say this then to tell me if it's,
I'm
I'm just wondering if the way to deal with that particular aspect is for chair and vice chair, when we're next looking at the planning of this committee and also the housing and safer communities, for example, think about where the most appropriate way to be able to have that conversation might be. I'd be happy for it to be at this committee potentially, but it may be that, as you say, the police may say actually it's not appropriate, or that it's more appropriately held in a different committee.
I was just going to say, Chair, I think that's a good idea, and I was partially going to suggest that because I was trying to pick up off what Councillor Holly was really intending, I think, and I thought you meant to have someone present as part of any future update on, you know, where we were with the action plan, didn't you, in light of the earlier discussion? Or am I misreading that? Rather than a separate debate on counter-terrorism?
I think so, because I think it's a discussion and a debate that feels sometimes like, you know, very entrenched positions perhaps, but we're slightly talking past each other. And the administration, I guess, is you know, completely concerned about the terrorist threat and the need to do these hostile vehicle measures, which Labour agree with. But we hear from public speakers and representatives of other groups that they don't necessarily believe that is the reason for it, that they think it's down to cafe licenses or whatever. And so you end up in a decision where you're not really engaging with the crux of the argument across the table. Because if one side doesn't believe that your motivation is as you say it is, you're always going to struggle to come to a point where there's a compromise or a view where you can accept what people are saying. And I think that's the difficulty with this. You know, we've got a position, it's set out, it meets the objectives of the police, but what we don't get from people saying reverse the ban is what the alternative is that still protects the city. And I think that's the difficult bit. I'm sorry, but Labour's position, for example, is completely nonsensical. It's we agree with the HVMs, but we'll reverse the ban. Those two things are mutually exclusive. You cannot do both. You're going to tell me that's not true, but it is true.
It isn't. So if you look at the guidance around hostile
I have
vehicle,
looked at the guidance.
so it's very
quite
clear.
You can't both stop vehicles entering a pedestrian area and allow vehicles to enter a pedestrian area and have safety. That's just not possible. If Labour had got an alternative approach, then I'd be very happy to hear it. I'm sure everybody would. But I've heard nothing apart from we will reverse the ban. I don't know what that means.
So I think there's probably a couple of different things that we just need to be clear on. The Labour position is a political position that we can all discuss. There is a separate reverse the ban coalition of 27 organisations in the city. All of the organisations in the city who represent, I think, elderly, disabled, various different communities who have all come together on the reverse the ban petition, which is the quite harrowing testimony that we've read in here. There is very clear guidance from the government about what we do or don't do around hostile vehicle mitigation, what we mean even by hostile vehicle mitigation. So do we mean a vehicle that's going to go along and blow itself up, or do we mean a vehicle that's going to drive very fast at a group of people? If we think it's a group of people that we're going to drive very fast at, then actually the key objective is to slow that vehicle down, because you can do significantly less. The government's guidance says, if you can reduce the speed of that vehicle significantly, it has an exponential reduction in the amount of damage that it can do to somebody. We all know it from our car safety campaigns, the difference between driving at 20 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour. Well, the difference between driving at 5 or 10 miles an hour versus 20 or 30 miles an hour is even more significant. And so it's about measuring an appropriate response to the threat level. And that's where I think people are talking at different points. And you're suggesting that people are talking across, across positions. I think that the point that's been missed by the Liberal Democrat and Green groups on this debate, this would be my personal view, but I think it's probably held by the stakeholders as well, is that you've taken a very, very specific, very black and white position over the use of Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, over the sort of overriding trump card that somehow preventing a terrorist atrocity trumps any other atrocity that we might commit to other people. And I'm using that word quite specifically because the City Human Rights Network has called this discriminatory. You've got one of the world's leading applied human rights specialists, world leading, who happens to be a professor at York University, who is calling this ban discriminatory. And that's one of the problems that we're here. It's not about trying to point score or trying to say Labour this or Lib Dem that. Ultimately, it's about how do people use our city and how can they access the city centre? And unfortunately, from my perspective, what we've heard this evening is an awful lot of things that we will do, things that will happen, things that we could do, things that we might do. We heard all of that a year ago. And the administration still chose to go ahead and remove an exemption, which has had a massive impact on thousands of people's lives. You don't need me to tell you, you just need to read your petition, read all of those comments. They're horrible.
I've read them. I don't disagree that it's had a massive impact on people's lives. The point is the police and counter-terrorism advice is unequivocal. Cars must be prevented from entering the foot street. And I still don't know what Labour's position is. Is it that there's a way of slowing these cars down? There's no actual defined.
There are many, many ways.
Councillor Kilbane comes to these
allowing
meetings every
access.
time
Sorry,
and says, sorry, I haven't finished yet. Councillor Kilbane comes to these meetings every time and says in May, Labour are going to sweep to power. I have no idea what would happen to the HVMs after May if in the unlikely event that Labour won the election.
I think the guidance is extremely clear, and every other city centre in the country
what would you
manages to have hostile vehicle mitigation that enables access to continue. That's the bottom line. It happens everywhere else in the country,
they're
and
mutually
yet in York,
exclusive.
they're not. It's just not true. That's not what the guidance says. Councillor Norman, and then I think Jim, you wanted to make a comment.
I just wanted to say the law is unequivocally clear too, and it says that you can't discriminate against people without putting mitigation in place first. And we, throughout this process, constantly still doing it, we just seem to act without thinking and without putting the mitigation in first. And, you know, I think that there are clear solutions that have been throughout this. We spent 25 grand on one of them. And then threw it in the bin because we didn't like it, apparently, probably because it would have cost more money. And the simple truth is you don't care enough about disabled people's lives to spend a few quid on helping them live. And I think that's disgusting. And I'm sickened to be a part of this council and to sit on it with individuals who think that is fair and right and just. And you need to take action before you exclude people. And that's what the law says, is what the UN says. It's abundantly clear in every country in the world that that's what you do. And to just ignore it and go, well, we need to do this first because it'll be cheaper, is outrageous.
I'm going to bring Jim in. I'm just going to caution that we're slightly getting heated here. I'm probably guilty of it myself, and we do just need to be mindful of that. Jim, I'm going to ask a comment. I've got a couple of things that I'd like to potentially propose, and then I'll draw the meeting to a close. Jim.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I've understood the gist of what's being said. First of all, the big argument for banning blue badge vehicles from the centre is based on advice from the police, which came from the counter-terrorist unit. That's point number one. Point number two, nobody's enforcing this, although it's been in place for a year. And basically all sorts of vehicles of any sort you like can go in and out of the city centre. That's the reality. Are we agreed on that? Point number three, we're talking about vehicles. I don't know the statistics, but somebody said recently to me that there have only been 4 hostile vehicle incidents in the UK in the last 20 years. That may be true, it may not, but that was what was said to me. But we're living in 2022. If you look at what's happening all over the world, there are much bigger and more damaging means of causing chaos. And Iran is supplying drones to the Russians to go in Ukraine. If you wanted to blow up the center of York, then you can get a drone which costs you £1,000 or something. What are you going to do about defending that? And finally, and this is the point which I've made before, and which really does concern me, especially with the report this week after the Manchester bombing, which was a backpack. The emergency services failed in dealing with the consequences. I really would think, and I would like to believe, that the council has taken steps to ensure that the emergency services have got the necessary action plans in place, because they clearly didn't in Manchester, they clearly didn't in London when Grenfell Tower burned, should such an incident happen. I don't want that incident to happen, but we're focusing in on one little aspect. And it really is, I think, it's important that the council looks at the consequences of the disaster should it occur. And if you can reassure me on that, then I'll go away a happy person.
Flick, I'll just bring you in for a comment, and then, as I say, I just wanted to make a couple of quick proposals and then move us on. Apologies, Councillor de Gonda, did you want to comment on that?
Just to respond
Sorry,
to
I
that,
didn't see. Yeah.
to that particular point, yes. Certainly, as someone who in the last month or so attended a counter-terrorism training event, I think you are perfectly right to say that there are many different methods that the police are aware of and advise authorities and organisations in this city, anticipating them. The main focus here is about, as you say, hostile vehicle as a weapon. There are obviously many other threats, as we're all aware of. You just have to watch the news or, like you say, refer to experience elsewhere. But I think just to put it in context, this is one of a number of actions that the counter-terrorism police take to help to keep the city safe and the people of this city. And it's really important that we do look at all methods that are available. And that is certainly the advice from the police, is that we shouldn't put all our eggs in any one basket. So, certainly the points you make are valid, and the businesses in this city have already had counter-terrorism advice, and they certainly I witnessed an incident on Fossgate fairly recently, where the benefits of that were quite clear. That the cafe owner very quickly evacuated their premises because they had a small fire in the cafe, but they had that training, so they were aware of what to do in an incident and had that preparedness. And that's the sort of thing that we have to share around, not just focus on vehicles or backpacks or whatever else it might be. We do have to have that awareness. And I think personally, as speaking as a member of the executive, I take that responsibility very seriously.
And can you reassure us that the emergency services are actually undergoing the sort of plans that you've been read? And can you reassure us that the emergency services are going through the plans and taking actions as a result of the recent report?
James
from Manchester.
James, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, emergency planning sits within my portfolio for my sins as well. So every gold commander, whether that's with the emergency services, whichever of the blue light service it is required to go on a gold commander course. It's called a magic course. And part of that is absolutely the lessons learned from Manchester and those sorts of incidents, and how our operational plans in the region would work. As it happens, we are also doing a piece of work. I'm not sure quite how we've got onto this, but that piece of work is also being rolled out across the council, reviewing the role of the commanders in the council and what training they should have as well.
So I think just to note, and I will bring you in, Flick, I think it possibly is something for Councillor Fenton's committee just to consider on the community safety point of view as to whether or not there's anything that you want to look at in light of the outcome from the Manchester bombing. And I would just add into that the timing of briefings to executive members and other decision makers, in light of the fact that I think it was acknowledged quite early on that some of the risk assessment briefings and terrorist advice was not briefed to exec members before the 18th of November meeting. And as I say, it's something that was confirmed to me by an officer at the time. And I think we do need to be mindful of the complexity of some of these decisions and make sure that we are really abreast of all of the issues, because I think, you know, I certainly would hold my hands up and say that I've done an awful lot of learning over the last 2 or 3 years on access issues and some of that sort of stuff. And I would like to think that everybody is in that space. Flick.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I appreciate I have spoken a lot this evening, but I just very quickly wanted to come back on Councillor Hollier's point. I would say that it might be a good idea to perhaps revisit the Martin Higgett Associates report, because that does actually give 4 possible schemes whereby blue badge holders could be admitted to the Foot Streets area through the hostile vehicle mitigation barriers. So that would be one thing. But, you know, the councillor talked about compromise. And I watched this meeting last year in preparation for coming today, and I felt very much at the end of that, there is a theme running through that, you know, as disabled people, we're unwilling to embrace change, but we can't change. Our access needs are our access needs. And that's why I'm always, you know, slightly concerned when I hear the word compromise. Again, the postcard comments speak for themselves, don't they? And I've said enough for tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Flick. I'll give you a brief comment back.
Very brief. That isn't what the Martin Higgett report does. It provides 4 scenarios, but accepts that the other scenarios, apart from the one chosen by the council, have a proportionate increase in the risk to public safety. It's not saying this is how you could meet the police advice in different ways. It is saying this is how, if you're happy to trade off some safety in particular areas, that alternative things could be done. That's not, you know, that's not a help in this situation. Well, I'll stop there.
I think we'll end up going back around that conversation if we're not careful. I would like to make 2 proposals, and then I would like to draw this item, and very, very quickly after that, the meeting to a close. One is, I mentioned early on about the fact that Westminster Council had been taken to the High Court and had their decision overturned. And that to me seems to be a very pertinent judgment in relation to decisions that have been made by this council. It was specifically around excluding people from an area that was deemed high risk and sterile, and a blue badge holder took the council to court because they felt that they hadn't had their rights duly adhered to, and the judgment was partially upheld. So some aspects of it were not upheld and some aspects of it were. I would like us to request that the monitoring officer considers the legal advice that we received at the time of this decision in light of the decision of the High Court, and satisfies himself from a legal perspective that he's comfortable that we're still in a safe, robust position I think that would be a sensible thing, given the context. So I would propose that we request that well, I think do we have to go to the executive to request the monitoring officer, or can we make a request to so we can make a request direct to the monitoring officer that we do that. Did you want to comment on that, Councillor?
Going back to this time last year, so would we be asking the monitoring officer to review the advice that the then monitoring officer obtained? Because didn't we get QC?
So we had some debate about the advice that was offered to the council. External advice was sought. The then monitoring officer gave assurances to this committee on 2 separate occasions that they would consult an equalities specialist, and the advice that was sought came from a town and country planning specialist. So I think that there were questions raised at the time as to whether or not the advice that we had was appropriate. And this committee asked that the public sector, that the executive satisfied themselves that the public sector equality duty had been sufficiently met. And that same external person gave an assurance ahead of the 18th of November meeting. So my point is that a equalities law has been invoked. So the Westminster judgment was based on the Human Rights Act. Actually, it was about whether you appropriately use Article 2 versus Article 8. And then subsequently, the council was found not to have fulfilled their full public sector equality duty because they hadn't given sufficient heed to it, essentially. But I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the full details, which is why I'm suggesting that we maybe go back to the monitoring officer and ask him to look at that judgment, look at the advice that we've received and the decisions that have been made, and satisfy ourselves that we're not open to a similar challenge.
The key word in any matter to do with this is proportionate, because there is a clear exemption on the grounds of national security from any discrimination, equality, and it's what is classed as proportionate. Now, it may be that 2 lawyers take a different opinion. The High Court may have taken one view as what was disproportionate, another one may take a different view. Sure. Clearly, if we have got the wrong advice, then we have to relook at our strategy. But it was based on the best advice available at that time.
So the judgment was that Westminster Council had not acted in a proportionate way to the level of threat and balancing the needs. So it is actually that point, in a way, that are we satisfied that the advice that we've had is robust, that we're happy to defend it. And as I say, from my point of view, it makes sense to me to ask the monitoring officer to go and have a look at that and satisfy himself that that's going to be okay. That's my proposal. I'm happy to put it to a vote. So if anybody, all those in favour of us doing that, if you could show now.
Just to clarify, so how would we ask the monitoring officer to report back? In what would it be, a standalone item at a future meeting, or would it be by correspondence? What do you envisage getting back?
I'm happy for him to circulate an email to members of the committee, copying in the relevant officers, saying that he's satisfied himself, so that we have a paper trail that says that we've checked this and we're happy with it.
Okay.
Yeah. So all those in favour of that approach, I just want to push it to the vote now because of the time. So if I can see a show of hands, all those in favour?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. The other that I want to propose to you, and I know that this is going to be controversial, but we might as well get it out of the way, seeing as how we've had one of those meetings. This council adopted a social model of disability. We all backed it. In light of the decision that we have all backed a social model of disability, I would like to propose that we recommend that executive, taking into account the petition that they have received, looks again at the decision to exclude all blue badge holders from the exemption to accessing the city centre. So all those in favour of us taking that recommendation to executive, if you could show now. Well, I'm trying to just rush us through. If you want to, I'm happy to have a 5-minute chat on it. Yeah.
Well, I thought we were going to discuss what recommendations to make in relation to the petition.
I'm happy to do that. There's a number of possibilities. I'm talking about recommendations from this committee in terms of actions that we want to take. I was going to come on to the petition as a second thing, but okay, I'm happy to take looking at the petition first if you would like to do that. But this is a very specific point around that actual decision in the context of the vote that we've all taken. Councillor
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but just a point of order really, that we've been looking at the action plan update tonight. We haven't been scrutinising a decision.
I'm going on the basis that we've had an awful lot of discussion and debate. We've talked about the various things around the exemption, and we've talked about the fact that we've adopted a social model of disability. We've heard quite a number of conversations about the number of barriers that are in place. We've talked about the fact that we haven't had an action plan that's been fully updated. And so I'm just saying, in the context of the decision that we've all taken, do we want to go back to the executive and ask them to satisfy themselves that that decision was robust and is whether or not something that they want to look at again? Because I personally think that they really should be doing. Councillor Fenton.
I don't know if I could seek some advice from Dawn. I think if we started the meeting with that as a proposition, then I think some of the debate might have helped find a way through in terms of other recommendations could have been put forward, and use that word again, we could maybe found a compromise. But given that wasn't a proposition at the beginning of the meeting, are we okay to take a vote now? I mean,
Shall I comment? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't need a start and an end point for a proposition. So if that answers your question, you know, yes, the chair is perfectly entitled to move, or anyone else in the committee is perfectly entitled to move something before them, so long as it is relevant to the debate that's been had about the issue. I had thought, having said that, Chair, when you first mentioned that, you were linking that into what you wanted to do further to the petition received, because they're kind of both interrelated from my perspective.
That was my initial intention.
Yeah,
but as I say, I was happy to take it around the other way.
I thought it perhaps made more sense to put your proposition in relation to the fact that you have had the petition referred to you, and in light of the petition, did you then want to make that would be an action that you could make in response to the petition? And I would say that's my personal view would be that would be more happy rather than in relation to
I'm happy that we do that then. I'll put that on ice for a minute, and we can have a think about the petition and then think about whether there's anything else that we want to do. So the council's schedule of petitions gives us a number of options in terms of how we would deal with a petition. They are requesting a detailed report on the issues, noting receipt of the petition and proposed action, requiring the executive member or persons taking any decisions on the matter to attend a meeting and answer questions, undertaking a detailed scrutiny review, gathering evidence, hearing from witnesses and making recommendations to the appropriate person or member making the decisions, or referring the matter to full council for debate according to the significance of the issues.
Or shall I say, Chair, anything else, actually?
Yeah.
They are starters for 10, as it were. So the fact that you've already proposed what you have proposed, which is the response from your perspective, might be to go back to the executive, would equally be appropriate.
Sorry, I don't know whether you want to vote on your proposition, and depending on the outcome of that, discuss an alternative proposition. I don't mind.
My thought was a quick way of dealing with it was to send it back to the executive and say, I think you might want to have a look at this again, essentially. I'm happy to just put that to a vote and see how it stands and fails, and then have a discussion about some of these other points here. To my mind, we've already done a couple of these things, and some of the other options that might be open to us might possibly be, well, we can discuss what they might be. I think I'm going to put it to a vote because I think that's just the simplest way forward. As I say, I'm proposing that we, as we make a recommendation back to executive, that they consider again the removal of the exemption of blue badge holders in light of the comments on the petition, a number of issues that have been raised in this evening's scrutiny, and consider whether they're still satisfied that that's the appropriate course of action. Okay, all those in favour of that proposition? All those against that proposition? Thank you. So that falls. So how do we wish to respond to the petition? Are we satisfied that enough has been done so far, or is there anything else that people would like to do? So Councillor Hollier, I saw your hand first.
I propose then that we note the petition. I think, as you said, we've already been through quite a number of those alternative possibilities. And I think that's what we'd normally do with the petition, isn't it? Note it and any actions that are arising in the report, which I guess is the action plan.
Okay, Councillor Pearson.
Yeah, well, I'd echo what Councillor Holly has just said, and that we've also already discussed various things to be added to the action plan this evening as a result of the discussions we've had tonight.
Councillor Fenton.
I think when petitions come to this committee, regardless of the subject matter, there is ordinarily an expectation of an officer report. So I wouldn't be entirely comfortable with the proposition as described by Councillors Hollier and Pearson in terms of it's very rare we would get a petition that we would say we will just note it. The expectation of those who've submitted a petition is that there will be a response from the council. And again, I look to Dawn to to correct me on that. So I don't think it would simply be appropriate to note a petition, particularly a petition of the size of this one. So my expectation, but if I were in the shoes of those who submitted the petition, would be that there would be a response. Now, whether that is a report to, it would ordinarily be to an executive member, but Dawn.
Yeah, just to clarify, Councillor Fenton, so normally you're quite right, we would receive a petition schedule that would have a detailed list of all the petitions that have been received by the council, at council or otherwise, you know, directly into a council officer during that period of time since the last time the schedule of petitions was considered. So that is a list, basically. Alongside that list, there's usually an annex to that document that basically says this is where the petitions have been considered in the interim period, because that was the process. It was never a matter of the petitions coming directly first to CSMC. The petitions would go to the decision maker, which is clearly not CSMC, for any action. And then CSMC would review those steps taken and see whether they wish to comment further. 9 times out of 10, the committee's been happy with the measures that have been taken by the decision maker, which is usually an executive member, and they have therefore noted those actions. That doesn't mean CSMC has to note those actions. So you're sort of right, Councillor Fenton, in the sense that normally what would happen is before the petition came to this committee, it would be heard first by the relevant decision maker who would propose their steps. Then the committee would review that and say whether they were happy with that or there was more work to be done, etc.
Councillor Norman.
Haven't we just voted that down though? Because the decision maker in this is clearly executive. So you've just voted against following the normal process for petitions unless you've got a counter proposal of some description.
There is a counter proposal on the table, I believe, but Councillor Fenton.
So no, I think that the proposition was quite explicit in terms of sort of thinking again on the decision that the executive took last year.
Just to be clear, the petition is specific in asking for actually the executive leader, but is asking for the decision to be looked at again. Think again. It's called reverse the ban. So it is short of me saying let's make a proposal to reverse the ban, which clearly isn't going to happen. My option to you was to say, do you want to have a look at that again?
I think where I was coming from is more from reading the comments in terms of there's a huge amount of detail in there, some of which points to, I think, things that, again, referring to the action plan, things that we can try and reflect in some of the things that we are trying to do, recognizing that will go nowhere near to satisfying the call for the ban to be reversed, as you said. So I think that a piece of work does need to happen to review those comments and pick out some of the things that can be done. How that is done, I mean, what would make sense from my perspective is for officers to go through that and produce a report for the executive member. That's what, and looking at what's in the constitution. So one of the options is requesting a detailed report on the issues. So I would hang it on that hook from a constitutional perspective.
Chair, that's certainly an option. As was your suggestion, as is the suggestion that councillors Hollier and Perkins put forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it's a hugely different than asking the executive to consider again whether or not they think that it's appropriate. I think probably what I will do is do a quick through the things that have been proposed. So we voted on one that fell. Councillor Hollier, I think, proposed that we note the report and take no further action. So all those in favour of that approach, if you could show now. I'm just trying to be quick.
But that's not what I proposed. What we proposed was to note the report and the actions that were in the action plan and to include the additional.
And to take no further action from this meeting.
Well, they're then in the action plan. Anyway, that's the proposal.
All those in favour of Councillor Hollier's proposal, if you could show now. All those against?
3.
Abstentions?
3. So that's lost, Chair.
That's lost. Councillor Fenton, I believe you have proposed that we request that a detailed report is pulled together to address the petition and that is taken to the executive member. Do you believe that that is the executive member for transport or the executive member for, I've forgotten what the title is, but covers the city centre?
My assumption would be transport.
Councillor de Gorne.
Comment on this. I think given that the decision was taken by the full executive last November, it should be the full executive.
Thank you, Councillor de Gorne.
That has responsibility.
I would agree with that.
So I'm not precious as to where it goes.
Well, except that we just voted against. I don't know if I can put that again.
No. I think you voted on something slightly different, Chair, in the sense that what you voted was to ask the executive to consider the petition and look at reversing the decision. I think what Councillor Fenton is saying.
I said reconsider their decision, not reverse their decision.
Sorry, yes, to reconsider their decision on yes, in relation to the ban. What Councillor Fenton, I think, is saying is a report to the executive member or the executive, who's not precious about which, looking in response to the comments that were made in the petition and putting a detailed report to that body. Yeah.
So Councillor de Gorne is requesting that it goes to the executive. And what we are suggesting is that we put together a detailed report which what's the right wording, addresses the issues raised within the petition, noting the comments and any issues therein, and considers them in relation to the current progress against the action plan.
Yeah.
Okay. All those in favour of that, if you could show now.
Everybody, sorry.
Okay. Right. I think that we've got somewhere. So unless anybody else has anything else that they want to raise on this particular agenda item, I am going to draw this agenda item to a close. We're not quite finished yet, Councillor Fisher, but you can. That's all right. It's all right. It's all right. I'm just going to thank officers and the exec member for attending, and particularly thank the stakeholders for coming and giving your time this evening. It's been quite considerably longer than I anticipated it would be, although perhaps in hindsight I should have anticipated that it would be as long as it has been. But your time is really very much valued. Thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, I've deferred agenda item 5 and agenda item 6. We'll look at when we can bring them back in a timely way. Agenda item 7 is the work plan, which is just to note anyway, and then we have no urgent business. So thank you all for your time this evening, and we can draw the